Mason Cole hadn't cried since they put Rachel in the ground. He'd stood dry-eyed in the Montana wind hat in hand and told himself that was the last time he'd let anything matter that much. He meant it. For 4 years, he meant it. Then the stagecoach from Billings rolled into Pine Ridge on a Tuesday morning in July, and a woman stepped down onto that dusty street who looked like she was either running from something terrible or already living inside it. Mason's chest did something it had no business doing, something he hadn't felt in years, something that scared him.
Dampernay.
If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button and follow along until the very end, because you won't want to miss what happens next. And drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Mason Cole had a system. He woke before the sun, before the roosters, before the world had any chance to disappoint him. He saddled his horse in the dark, rode the fence line in silence, and returned to a house that hadn't had a woman's voice in it for 4 years. He ate what he cooked, fixed what broke, and spoke only when spoken to, and even then sparingly. He was 36 years old, and he had decided quietly and without ceremony that this was enough. It wasn't happiness. He knew what happiness felt like. Rachel had been happiness. Rachel had been warm coffee on cold mornings, and laughter that carried across the mountain, and the particular way she'd tilted her head when she was about to prove him wrong. Rachel had been the reason he'd built the extra room onto the east side of the house, the one with the window that caught the morning light. Rachel had been gone 4 years, and that room still sat empty, the door kept shut. So Mason Cole did what a man did when life had already handed him its worst. He built walls, he built fences, and he kept moving forward, efficient, practical, alone. The advertisement had been his foreman's idea. "You need help," said Dutch Hargrove, who had worked the Cole Ranch for 11 years and had earned the right to say uncomfortable truths. He'd set down his coffee mug and looked at Mason the way a man looks at a problem he's tired of walking around. "Not just ranch hands. You need somebody in that house. Somebody who can manage the accounts, keep track of the suppliers, make sure Calhoun's outfit isn't charging you triple for what the general store sells for half. I don't need a wife, Dutch." Didn't say wife, said help. Dutch had paused, then said it anyway. But a wife wouldn't hurt. Mason had said no. He'd said it 3 times over the course of a week, and each time Dutch had nodded respectfully and come back 2 days later with the same argument dressed up differently. The 4th time, Mason was looking at the account ledgers and discovered he'd been overcharged for grain by $40 over the last 3 months. He sat with that number for a long time. Then he picked up a pen. Mountain rancher seeks practical wife. No promises of romance. Honesty and hard work required. Cole Ranch, Pine Ridge, Montana territory. He hadn't promised love. He hadn't promised warmth or companionship or anything approaching the softness that word wife implied. He'd been honest, which was the one thing he knew how to be. He'd received 9 replies. He'd written back to 3. 2 had stopped corresponding when they understood just how remote the ranch was, how long the winters ran, how little society Pine Ridge had to offer. The 3rd wrote back every week for 6 weeks. Her name was Eleanor Whitmore, and she wrote the way someone speaks when they've spent a long time choosing their words carefully, measured, precise, nothing wasted. She said she was 27. She said she was from Philadelphia. She said she was not afraid of hard work and had managed household accounts since she was 16. She did not mention family beyond saying that her circumstances had changed, and she was seeking a new life in the West. Mason hadn't pushed. He respected people who kept some things to themselves. He did the same. He wrote back and told her he'd meet her stagecoach on the 14th of July. Pine Ridge in July was exactly what it always was. A sun-baked collection of weatherboard buildings strung along a single main road, baking under a Montana sky so blue it hurt to look at. The mercantile, the saloon, the land office, the church at the far end of the road that only filled up when someone died or someone married. A population of maybe 300 souls, most of them weathered past their years, most of them minding each other's business with cheerful relentlessness. Mason arrived 40 minutes before the stage was due. He tied his horse at the post outside the mercantile and stood on the boardwalk with his hat brim pulled low, watching the road. He wasn't nervous. He told himself that twice. Old Marjorie Hatch emerged from the dry goods store beside him, took one look at his posture, and said, "You waiting on something? Mason Cole, or just practicing standing?" "Stage," he said. She looked at the empty road, looked back at him, and her eyes sharpened. "That mail-order bride of yours?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Didn't know that was common knowledge." "In Pine Ridge." She laughed not unkindly. "Son, you sneeze on your mountain, and we know about it before noon." He didn't respond, which was response enough. Marjorie settled her basket on her arm and lowered her voice with the particular tone she used when she meant something. "Just be decent to her, Mason. Whatever she's expecting, it won't be what she finds. Make sure she don't regret the trip." Then the stagecoach came around the bend in the road, trailing a long plume of dust, and Marjorie slipped away. Mason straightened. The coach pulled to a rattling stop in front of the stage office, and the driver climbed down from the box, and two men in traveling clothes stepped out first. A drummer with a case of samples, a land speculator with the look of someone who'd been disappointed by everything he'd seen so far and expected more of the same. Then she stepped down. Mason Cole had prepared himself for practical. He'd prepared himself for plain, for tired, for the worn-at-the-edges look of a woman who'd been surviving something for a long time. He'd told himself none of that mattered. He only needed competence. He was not prepared for Eleanor Whitmore. She was not what he'd expected, and he couldn't have said precisely why, except that she moved through the world like she was already calculating it. Not beautiful in the soft, approachable way of women who'd been admired all their lives, though she was undeniably striking, dark-haired and straight-backed, with eyes that caught the light and held it but sharp-edged in a way that made his brain pause and recalibrate. She looked at the town first. That was the thing he noticed before anything else. Not at him. Not at the faces watching her from doorways and windows, and they were watching because this was Pine Ridge and nothing went unexamined. She looked at the street, the side alleys, the exit points. It was the way a person looked at a place when they needed to know how to leave it. Then she looked at him, directly without flinching, the way people rarely looked at Mason because he was a large, quiet man, and his face didn't invite idle scrutiny. She walked toward him. Her bag, a small leather satchel that she kept close to her body, looped over her shoulder, with her hand resting on the strap, moved with her like a second skin. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Miss Whitmore." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good journey." "Long," she said. Then, with the efficiency he'd admired in her letters, "I appreciate you meeting me. I have one trunk. I travel light." "I've got a wagon." "Good." That was the beginning of their conversation. He'd have called it efficient if he hadn't caught in the half-second between sentences the way her eyes had cut sideways to the far end of the street and then come back to him. He'd almost asked about it. Then the man appeared. He came from between the land office and the telegraph building, a man in a black vest and a dark traveling coat, the kind of clothes that said money without quite shouting it. He was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, with the careful stillness of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He surveyed the street with the proprietary calm of a man who believed most things in his vicinity belonged to him. His eyes landed on Eleanor. Something happened in her face. Something she controlled instantly so fast, Mason almost missed it, a single sharp flicker of recognition and fear compressed into half a heartbeat. And then her expression went smooth and blank as winter ice. She didn't run. She didn't flinch. She simply angled her body one small deliberate degree closer to Mason. The man in the black vest approached without hurry, which was somehow worse than rushing. "Miss Whitmore," he said. His voice was smooth, Eastern-inflected, the voice of a man used to boardrooms and negotiations. "Your father will be relieved to know you're safe." "I'm sure he will," Eleanor said. Her voice was perfectly level. "He'd like you to come home." "I'm not going home, Mr. Graves." The man Graves let his gaze move to Mason then. Assessing. calculating the angles the way men like him always did, putting numbers on things that didn't have prices. "And you are," he said. Mason looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Eleanor. She was still composed, still controlled, but he could see now that he knew to look the way her hand had tightened on the strap of that bag. A person didn't run 1,200 miles from Philadelphia to Montana to be dragged back by a man in a traveling coat. A person made that journey for reasons that were their own, and a person who'd written to him every week for 6 weeks, honest and careful and practical, had not come here to be someone's property returned to sender. Mason shifted his weight slightly the way he did when he was about to make a decision he intended to stand behind. "Mason Cole," he said. "Her husband." The word dropped into the afternoon air like a stone into still water, and the ripples went out in every direction. Graves went very still. Eleanor made no sound, but he felt at the edge of his peripheral vision the smallest change in her posture. Not surprise exactly, but something settling. Like something that had been braced for impact had decided not to brace. "That," said Graves softly, "is a matter I'd advise you not to involve yourself in, Mr. Cole." "Don't reckon I have a choice," Mason said. "She came out here to be my wife. That makes everything that concerns her concern me." Graves looked at him for a long moment, the look of a man reordering his approach. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a card, which he held out to Mason with 2 fingers. "Your choice," he said. "But her father is Clarence Whitmore. If that name means anything to you, and it will when you've had time to think on it, you'll understand that this isn't a situation that benefits from stubbornness." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked back the way he'd come, unhurried, already thinking 3 moves ahead. Mason looked at the card. Reginald Graves, Attorney at Law, Philadelphia. Below that, a Billings address written in fresh ink. He put it in his shirt pocket. He looked at Eleanor Whitmore. She looked back at him, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, the calculation in her eyes had shifted into something less guarded. She was reading him the way she'd read the town exits angles threat assessments. But there was something else in it now. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "What's done is done." He picked up her trunk with one hand. "Wagons this way." Why? She didn't speak for the first hour of the ride. He didn't push. The road climbed out of the flat lowland and into the foothills, the pines thickening on either side, the air cooling by degrees as the elevation rose. Mason kept his eyes on the road and his thoughts to himself, which was where he kept them best. Beside him on the wagon seat, Eleanor sat straight-backed, and still the satchel across her lap, her hands resting on it. After a while he noticed she'd stopped scanning the tree line. He took that as a good sign. "Clarence Whitmore," he said finally. Not a question, just the name set down between them like something to be examined. "My father," she said. "Railroad man." She looked at him sideways. "You know him, know of him. Northern Pacific came through this territory 3 years ago. His name was on the contracts." He kept his voice neutral. "Influential man." "Yes," she said. "He is." "What does he want?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, with the same directness she'd used in her letters, he had arranged a marriage. A business arrangement between himself and Senator Aldrich of Ohio. I was the arrangement. Mason processed that. "And you objected." "I objected," she said simply. Repeatedly in writing, in person, and ultimately by boarding a train and not informing him I was leaving. "And the bag?" She looked down at the satchel. Something moved through her expression, something carefully neutral. "Documents," she said. "Personal correspondence. Things I needed to have." He nodded and let it lie. After another silence, she said, "You didn't have to call yourself my husband." It was the most direct solution. "He'll find out it isn't legal." "Not yet," Mason said, "but that can be corrected." She turned to look at him fully then, and he could feel the weight of that gaze, even with his eyes on the road. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I want to be clear about something. I came here to work to be useful, to build something that's mine. I didn't come here to be a burden or a complication or something you have to manage on top of everything else. All right, he said. I also want to be clear that I don't expect... She paused, and there was something careful in the pause. I don't expect anything from this that you didn't put in your advertisement. Honesty, hard work, no promises. That's what I offered, he agreed. Then we understand each other. We do. She faced forward again, and the wagon rolled on, and the mountain rose up around them, with all its pines and granite, and absolute indifference to the complications of human beings. Mason thought against his better judgment. She's going to be trouble. He thought it the way you think something that is also underneath everything. The first interesting thing to happen in a very long time. The ranch house was not what Eleanor had expected. She'd expected rough. She'd been prepared for rough. She'd prepared herself on the long journey west for the kind of bare necessity existence that required a woman to forget everything about curtains and carpets and hot water delivered by a maid. What she had not prepared for was the care of it. The house was bigger than she'd imagined, built of good timber and mountain stone, solid in the way things were solid when someone had built them to last, rather than to impress. But it was the details that caught her off guard. The window boxes on the front, planted with something that had gone to dry stalks. Someone had planted flowers once and hadn't quite been able to stop. The way the porch boards fit cleanly together without gaps. The iron hooks by the door evenly spaced for hanging things. Somebody had built this house the way you build a home and then had been left living in it alone. She didn't say any of this. She simply took in the space and began cataloging it the way she cataloged everything: what worked, what was missing, what could be better. Dutch Hargrove met them in the yard, a barrel-chested man somewhere in his 50s with a sun-weathered face and eyes that missed nothing. He took one look at Eleanor and then looked at Mason with the expression of a man who was revising his expectations upward. "Dutch," Mason said, "this is Eleanor Whitmore. She'll be managing the house accounts." Dutch pulled off his hat. "Ma'am, welcome to the Cole Ranch." "Thank you, Mr. Hargrove." She extended her hand the way you extended it to someone you intended to work with as an equal. He shook it with visible approval. "You'll want the tour," Dutch said. "I will," she agreed. "But not tonight. Tonight I'd like to review whatever ledgers and account books you have if Mr. Cole doesn't object." Mason didn't object. He showed her to the room she'd be staying in, one of the guest rooms on the west side of the house, nothing to do with the room on the east that kept its door closed and left her with a lamp, and the last 3 years of account books which Dutch had kept in a system that was thorough, if not particularly efficient. He went to stand on the porch in the night air and told himself that this was fine. This was practical. This was exactly what he had advertised. He stood there a long time listening to the scratch of a pen from behind a lit window and did not examine too closely why that sound made the house feel different. She found the problem in the Calhoun contracts by 10 o'clock. By 11, she had found 2 more. By the time Mason came in from checking the horses, she was sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by open ledgers and loose papers, a cold cup of coffee at her elbow, and she had the look of someone who had been surprised by what they'd found and hadn't yet decided how to handle it. "Mr. Cole," she said without preamble, "Calhoun suppliers have been charging you for 40-pound feed sacks and delivering 30-pound sacks since at least February of last year. That's a difference of $12 per delivery, and based on what I see here, you've had at least 20 deliveries in that period." He stood very still. $240. $240, and that's just Calhoun. Whitmore Dry Goods' different family I checked has been billing for premium oats and sending standard grain since March. She looked up at him. "Who's been managing the accounts?" "I have," he said, "when I had time." She didn't say anything judgmental. She just nodded as though she'd already accounted for that and moved past it. "There's more," she said, "but it can wait until morning if you'd prefer." "Tell me now," she told him. She went through it methodically without softening it, which he appreciated more than she could have known. She laid out the numbers the way a surgeon lays out instruments, clean, precise, without ceremony. By the time she was done, it was past midnight and Mason was standing with his hands flat on the table, looking at the ledgers, with the expression of a man who'd been walking on ice without knowing it and had just been shown how thin it was. "How bad," he said. "If it continues, bad. If it stops now, and you recover what's owed, manageable." She looked at him steadily. "But it can't continue." "No," he said. "It can't." She began neatening the papers, stacking the ledgers with the precise economy of someone who organized out of genuine instinct. "I can write the letters tomorrow if you'd like. To Calhoun and Whitmore both. I've done this before. Business correspondence was part of my responsibilities at home." He studied her for a moment. In the lamplight, she looked less guarded than she had in town, though he suspected she'd be appalled if she knew that. "What kind of home?" he said. She paused, hands stilling on the ledgers. "A wealthy one," she said, "with its own particular set of requirements." He didn't push. He was beginning to understand that with Eleanor Whitmore, what she offered was what you got, and pressing for more was likely to be counterproductive. "All right," he said, "write the letters." She nodded. Then, almost as an afterthought, "Mr. Cole." He'd started toward the door. "Yeah. Thank you," she said, "for what you did in town. With Mr. Graves." A pause. "I know it complicated things." He looked back at her. She was watching him with that clear, steady gaze, and there was something in it that wasn't asking for sympathy, wasn't asking for anything really, except acknowledgement. "You can call me Mason," he said. "Reckon we're past formalities." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. The beginning of one, maybe. "Good night, Mason," she said. He walked out onto the porch and stood in the dark for a long time listening to the mountain wind, and told himself he was not in any kind of trouble. He told himself that 3 times. He didn't believe it any of the 3. The next 2 weeks settled into a shape that was nothing like what Mason had imagined, and more functional than he'd had any right to hope for. Eleanor rose before he did, which startled him the first morning, and did not startle him again. She made coffee in the kitchen with the focused efficiency of someone who viewed cooking as a system to be optimized, and she was usually at the table with the account books before he'd finished his first cup. She wrote the letters to Calhoun and Whitmore. Calhoun wrote back with bluster and denials. She wrote back with specificity dates, delivery weights, billing records, a request for a federal weights and measures inspector if he found the records insufficient. Calhoun did not write again. A check arrived from his office 11 days later for the full $240. "How'd you know he'd fold?" Dutch asked, reading the check with the expression of a man who'd been waiting for divine intervention. "Men like Calhoun are certain they'll never be caught," Eleanor said without looking up from the ledger she was amending. "When they are, they'd rather pay than explain themselves." Dutch had looked at Mason over her head. Mason had looked at Dutch. A wordless negotiation was conducted, and a conclusion was reached. Dutch thought she was the best thing that had happened to Cole Ranch in 4 years. Mason was declining to confirm or deny anything. The days arranged themselves into a rhythm. She managed the house. She managed the accounts. She rode with him twice to Pine Ridge for supplies, sitting straight in the wagon with that bag over her shoulder, her eyes moving over the town with the same watchful awareness he'd seen on the first day. He didn't ask about her father again. He didn't ask about the bag. She didn't offer. They moved around the subject the way 2 people move around furniture in a small room carefully, with full awareness of where it was choosing not to bump into it. They ate dinner together, which had not been his custom. She'd arrived and assumed they'd eat dinner together, and he hadn't corrected her because he hadn't wanted to, and he'd been living with that not wanting in the back of his mind, like a low harmonic. He hadn't figured out how to stop hearing. She asked questions over dinner. Not intrusive ones about the ranch, the land, the history of the territory, the names of the peaks visible from the east window. She asked about Rachel once. Sideways, referring to the dried stalks in the window boxes, and he told her the bare facts of it 4 years ago, fever too fast to stop, and she had listened and said simply, "I'm sorry," and moved on. No pity, no lingering, just acknowledgement and forward motion. He appreciated that more than he could have explained. "The window boxes," she said at dinner on the 14th evening. "Can they be replanted?" He looked up. "The window boxes," she said again. "The ones on the front. Whatever was in them, it's been gone a long time. If I ordered seed from the catalog—" "Plant what you want," he said. It came out rougher than he intended. She looked at him for a moment, reading him the way she read ledgers looking for the discrepancy, finding it. "All right," she said quietly, and changed the subject. He sat with that for the rest of the evening, the weight of what he'd said, and what he'd meant underneath it, which was not "don't plant things," but something closer to, "I'm afraid of caring what this place looks like again." He sat with it on the porch after she'd gone in, listening to the wind in the pines, and did not try to resolve it. Some things took longer than 2 weeks. It was Dutch who saw the riders first. 3 weeks after Eleanor arrived, Dutch came into the barn where Mason was working a young mare and said without preamble, "3 men on the road from town, coming up slow. Nice horses." Nice horses meant money. Money at this altitude coming from that direction meant intent. Mason set down the lead line. "Armed. Rifle on 2, sidearm on all 3. Dutch's voice was even, but his eyes weren't. "One of them's wearing a city suit." Mason walked out of the barn into the July heat and stood watching the road. Beside him, without being called, Eleanor appeared from the house door. She'd heard. He didn't ask how she always heard, he was realizing, because she was always listening. She looked at the approaching riders and went very still. "Do you know them?" he said. "The man in the suit," she said. "His name is Harold Percy. He works for my father." Her voice was calm. Her voice was always calm. But he could see from where he stood the way her hand had found the strap of the bag that was over her shoulder, as it always was, and gripped it. He stepped forward, so he was half a step ahead of her. It wasn't a decision he consciously made. It was the same thing he'd done in Pine Ridge, his body moving before his reasoning caught up. The 3 riders pulled up in the yard. Harold Percy was a thin man, 50s, with the colorless efficiency of someone who'd spent his career delivering other men's messages. He looked at Mason with the flat assessment of a man pricing a threat. "Mr. Cole," he said. "Mr. Percy," Mason said, because Eleanor had named him, and he saw no reason not to acknowledge it. Percy looked at Eleanor. "Miss Whitmore?" "Mrs. Cole," Eleanor said. Her voice didn't waver by a syllable. Percy took that in, recalculated. "Your father has sent me to discuss the matter of your return." "There's no matter to discuss," Eleanor said. "I'm exactly where I intend to be." "Your father is not here," she said, "and has no standing to make decisions about my life." Percy shifted in his saddle. His eyes went to Mason, measuring the way Graves had measured, looking for the price of a man. "Mr. Cole, I'm authorized to offer you compensation for any inconvenience this situation may have caused." "She's not a situation," Mason said. His voice was quiet. It was always quieter when he meant something most. Percy looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat and produced a sealed letter, which he held out toward Eleanor. "Your father's terms," he said. She didn't move toward it. Mason took it from him. He looked at Percy evenly. "I'll see that she knows what's in it," he said. "That's all I'm promising." Percy sat a moment longer, a man weighing options and finding them limited. "Mr. Whitmore has considerable resources," he said, "and considerable patience." "So do mountains," Mason said. He held Percy's gaze until Percy looked away. Then Percy turned his horse, and the 2 armed men turned with him, and they rode back down the road in the same deliberate, unhurried way that all of Clarence Whitmore's people seemed to travel, as though the outcome were already decided and only the timing remained. Eleanor stood in the yard. She watched them go. "You didn't have to speak for me," she said when they were gone. "Didn't speak for you." He was still watching the road. "Spoke for myself. That's my property line they came across." A long silence. "Mason," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at him with that clear, straight look of hers, and there was something in it he hadn't seen before, something that was trying to name itself and hadn't found the word yet. "Thank you," she said, for the second time, like she meant it twice as much. He handed her the letter. "Read it when you're ready," he said, "and then tell me what we're dealing with." He walked back to the barn, and he heard behind him the sound of paper tearing open, and then silence, and he told himself very firmly that whatever was in that letter, they would handle it. We. He noticed the word. Noticed it the way you notice the first green thing coming up after a long winter. He didn't try to push it back down. The letter was what she'd expected, and worse. She came to find him in the barn an hour later when she'd read it twice and sat with it and decided she was done sitting with it alone. He was working the mare again, patient, methodical hands easy on the lead. He looked up when she came in. She held out the letter. "He's engaged a lawyer in Helena," she said. "He's going to argue that our marriage isn't legal because it wasn't properly registered." Mason read it. His expression didn't change, which she'd come to understand meant he was thinking hard. "Is he right?" he said. "We haven't registered it with the territorial court," she said. "We haven't. There was no ceremony." She looked at him directly. "There is no marriage, Mason. Not a legal one." He folded the letter. "Then we fix that." She stared at him. "It's not—" "You came out here to be my wife," he said. "That was the agreement. You've held up your end of it." He set the letter on the barn wall and looked at her. "If a ceremony and a filing will solve the problem, we do a ceremony and a filing." "That's not what I—" She stopped. Started again. "I don't want you to do this because of my father. I don't want you to be obligated. I offered it in Pine Ridge," he said. "I'm offering it again now. It's not obligation." He paused. A long pause, the kind that had weight in it. "It's what makes sense." Eleanor Whitmore had sat across tables from powerful men her entire life and listened to their arguments and measured their sincerity and found it more often than not wanting. She was not unaccustomed to people offering things that served their own interests dressed in the language of generosity. This was not that. This was a man who had already twice put himself between her and her father's reach without being asked, without calculating what it would cost him, with nothing but the plainness of a person who had decided what was right and was doing it. She didn't know what to do with that. She'd been managing around it for 3 weeks, and she was running out of room to manage. "All right," she said. "I'll talk to Reverend Haynes in the morning." "All right," she said again. And then, because she was Eleanor Whitmore and she did not leave things unexamined, "Mason." "Yeah. When this is over, when my father's run out of lawyers and there's nothing left to fight, you can end it. If you want to. Properly, legally. I won't hold you to something you only did to help me." He looked at her for a long moment. "Let's get through what's in front of us first," he said. He picked up the lead line again and went back to the mare, and Eleanor stood in the barn doorway with the letter in her hand and something pressing up against the inside of her chest that she was not going to name yet because there was too much still to deal with, and she was a practical woman. But she felt it. She felt it the way you feel the sun when you've been cold for a very long time, that first warmth, almost startling, that makes you remember what warmth was before you forgot it. She folded the letter and put it in her bag beside the documents she'd carried from Philadelphia, the ones that mattered, the ones that were going to matter more before this was over. She walked back to the house. In the kitchen, she put the kettle on and sat down at the table with the ledgers and worked until the lamp burned low. Outside, the Montana mountain held them both in its dark and its wind and its absolute endurance, and somewhere in the night a coyote called, and the horses shifted in the barn, and the house that had been quiet for 4 years held inside its walls the particular complicated silence of two people who had not yet said what they were thinking, but were beginning to. Reverend Haynes married them on a Thursday morning with Dutch Hargrove and Dutch's wife Bet, as witnesses in the small front parlor of the Cole Ranch house with no flowers and no guests, and a ceremony that lasted 11 minutes by the clock on the mantel. It was not the kind of wedding that got written about in the Pine Ridge Gazette. Mason stood in his good shirt, the dark one he hadn't worn since Rachel's burial, which he'd taken out that morning and pressed without quite examining why he was being careful about it, and said the words Reverend Haynes asked him to say, in a voice that was steady and clear. Eleanor stood beside him in the only dress she'd brought that wasn't a traveling dress, a deep blue wool that was slightly too warm for July, but carried itself well, and said her words with the same precise calm she brought to everything. When Haynes said, "You may kiss your bride," there was a single beat of silence that lasted longer than it should have. Then Mason turned to her. He looked at her face, those clear, measuring eyes, and he leaned forward and pressed his lips to her cheek, brief and careful, the way you handle something you're not sure yet how to hold. Eleanor didn't move away. That was what he noticed most. She didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't put the professional distance between them that she usually maintained like a surveyor's line. She stood still and let it happen, and when he straightened, she looked up at him with an expression he couldn't name and didn't try to. Bet Hargrove cried. She was that kind of woman, and she wasn't apologetic about it. Dutch shook Mason's hand with both of his, which was the most emotion Dutch Hargrove had publicly displayed in 11 years of Mason's knowing him. They filed the paperwork that afternoon at the Territorial Court in Pine Ridge. The clerk stamped it. The judge signed it. It was legal documented and recorded in the Territory's books as of July the 17th, 1884. Mason Cole and Eleanor Whitmore Cole. On the ride home, the wagon moving easy in the late afternoon heat, Mason said, "I'll write to your father's lawyer tonight. Send the filing number." "I'll write it," Eleanor said. "You don't have to." "I want to." A pause. "I've been writing letters to manage my father's reach since I was 19 years old. I know exactly what words he responds to." She looked at the road ahead. "Let me do this one." He handed her the reins and let her drive. She didn't comment on that. But he saw from the corner of his eye her shoulders drop a fraction, just one small private release of something she'd been carrying upright all day. The letter went out with the next morning's post. The reply came back in 4 days, and it was not what either of them had expected. So, it wasn't from the Helena lawyer. It was from Clarence Whitmore himself. Eleanor read it standing at the kitchen table, while Mason watched her face, which told him more than the words ever would. She went through it once fast, the way you go through something when you're afraid of what it says. Then she went through it again slowly. Then she set it down on the table and stood with her hands flat on the surface and looked at the far wall. "He's coming himself," she said. Mason had gathered that from the shift in her breathing alone. "When?" "2 weeks." She picked the letter back up and read from it directly, her voice perfectly level. "I have retained the services of Mr. Frederick Calloway of the Helena Bar Association, who advises me that this marriage performed under duress and without proper notice to the family may be subject to legal challenge. I am traveling to Montana to evaluate the situation personally and to discuss terms with your current husband. I trust you will receive me." She put the letter down. "He doesn't ask. He trusts I will receive him." "He doesn't know you very well," Mason said. Something crossed her face, painful and tired and old all at once. "He knows me well enough," she said. "He knows I won't refuse because I won't give him the satisfaction of a scene." She looked at Mason. "He'll come here, and he'll look at this ranch, and he'll look at you, and he'll offer you money. He'll make it very practical. He's very good at making things practical." "How much?" She looked at him sharply. "I'm asking," he said, "so I know what number to turn down." The sharpness in her eyes softened into something complicated. "He'll start with enough to clear your debts and leave you something over," she said. "And if you refuse, that he'll go higher, and he'll keep going until he finds the number." "What if there isn't a number?" She studied him. "Most men have a number, Mason. Most men haven't been living on this mountain long enough to stop caring what money can buy." He said it without self-pity, just fact. The things I want aren't for sale." Eleanor Whitmore stood very still for a moment. Then she picked up the letter and folded it carefully and put it in her bag. In that place, she put things she needed to keep, and she said, "Then we'd better get ready." Getting ready, it turned out, looked mostly like working. Eleanor threw herself into the ranch accounts with a focus that had sharpened from diligent to something close to driven. She rode with Dutch to the eastern grazing fields to count the cattle properly, a count that hadn't been done accurately in over a year, Dutch admitted with some embarrassment. She negotiated a new contract with a feed supplier out of Bozeman who charged honest weights, and she canceled the Calhoun account entirely in a letter so precise and cheerful that Mason had read it twice just to appreciate the craftsmanship. She also, without announcement, planted the window boxes. He came in from the south pasture one afternoon and found her on the porch with dirt on her hands and a flat of seedlings from the Pine Ridge Mercantile, pressing them carefully into the old boxes with the focused expression she brought to ledgers and correspondence. He stopped. She looked up, soil on her cheek, sun on her hair. Something in her eyes that was almost defiant, like she'd been waiting for him to object. He didn't say anything. He went inside and got his work gloves and came back out and knelt down beside the second box and said, "What are these?" She blinked. "Lavender," she said after a moment. "And some asters. They're hardy. They'll come back on their own next year." He nodded. He pressed the next seedling in with his thumb, careful around the roots. They worked in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable silence, a different kind. The kind that happens between people who have run out of needing to fill space with words and discovered they don't mind. "Rachel planted marigolds," he said. He hadn't planned to say it. Eleanor's hand stilled. "She said they kept the bugs off," he said. "I never knew if that was true or if she just liked the color." "Both things can be true," Eleanor said quietly. "Yeah." He pressed another seedling in. "I think both things were true." She didn't try to say anything comforting. She just went back to planting, and he went back to planting, and when they were done, the boxes were full, and the porch had a different look to it, not the same as before, but alive again in its own way. He'd been afraid of that. The being alive again in its own way. He was starting to think he might survive it. It was Bet Hargrove who told her about the talk in town. Bet came up to the ranch on a Wednesday with a pie she didn't need to bring, and a look on her face that said she'd brought it specifically as cover for the conversation she needed to have. She found Eleanor in the kitchen going over invoices and set the pie on the table and sat down and folded her hands. "I need to tell you something," Bet said, "and I need you to hear it and not let it wound you more than it has to." Eleanor looked up from the invoices. "Tell me." Bet pressed her lips together. "Pine Ridge is talking," she said. "About you. About your father and what he's said about why you left Philadelphia, and—" She stopped, started again. "Mrs. Oakes at the dry goods said yesterday that a man came through town last week, well-dressed man talking to people, asking questions about Mason, about the marriage, about whether it was," she chose the word carefully, "suitable." "Suitable?" Eleanor repeated. "Whether it was real," Betty said plainly. "Whether Mason married you honest, or whether you'd—" She stopped. "Whether I'd manipulated him," Eleanor said. Flat, clean, like she'd already heard it. Bet's face went unhappy. "They're saying your father's people have been telling folks in town that you've got a history of instability, that you've made scenes before, accusations." She reached across and put her hand over Eleanor's. "I don't believe a word of it, and Dutch doesn't either, and most people with sense don't. But Clarence Whitmore is putting money behind this story, and money talks, and I thought you needed to know." Eleanor sat with that for a long moment. Her father was efficient. She'd always known that about him. He didn't waste resources on direct confrontation when he could spend half as much undermining the ground under someone's feet before the confrontation even began. He'd done it to her mother. He'd done it to business partners, to competitors, to anyone who stood between him and what he wanted. She hadn't thought he'd do it here. In this small town. In this place she'd tried to make a start. She'd underestimated him. She didn't intend to do it twice. "Thank you, Bet," she said. Her voice was steady. "Honestly, thank you for coming to tell me." Bet squeezed her hand. "You're good for him," she said. "Mason. He was—" She stopped, and there was something tender and worried in her eyes. He'd gone very far inside himself after Rachel. Dutch was afraid he wasn't going to come back. And since you've been here, She stopped again. "He laughs more," she said finally. "Not much. Not loud, but some. And that means something." Eleanor looked at her hands when Bet left. She sat with the invoices unfinished and thought about her father and what he'd already put in motion and what was still coming. Then she got up and found Mason. He was in the corral with the young mare, same as most afternoons, and he listened to her tell him what Bet had said without interrupting, standing with his arms folded and his hat pushed back, his eyes on the horse while she talked. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "They're saying you manipulated me," he said. "Among other things. Into a marriage you needed for protection." "Yes." He looked at her then. "Did you?" She met his eyes. "I answered your advertisement," she said. "I told you the truth about what I could offer. I didn't tell you about my father, and I should have. I should have told you everything before you called yourself my husband in that street, and I didn't because I was afraid you'd send me away, and that wasn't fair to you." She held his gaze. "But I didn't manipulate you. I never tried to. If that's what you think—" "I don't," he said. Just that. 2 words immediate, like he'd been holding them ready. She stopped. "I've known men who were manipulated," he said. "I know what it looks like. It doesn't look like a woman who stayed up until midnight fixing my accounts the first night she arrived." He turned back to the mare. "What it looks like is your father trying to give me a reason to doubt you before he gets here?" The relief that moved through her was physical. She felt it in her knees. She hadn't realized until that moment how much she'd been braced against his answer. "He's very good at it," she said when she trusted her voice again. "I expect he is." Mason ran his hand along the mare's neck. "But I make my own conclusions." She stood at the corral fence and watched him work with the horse, those careful, patient hands, that unhurried authority, and thought about what Bet had said. He laughs more. She'd noticed it too. In small ways, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. The way he'd looked when the Calhoun check arrived and she'd read the amount aloud, one quick, surprised flash of humor crossing his face before he put it away. The way he'd answered Dutch's terrible jokes at dinner 2 nights ago, with one of his own quiet enough that it had taken her a full second to understand it was a joke. And then Dutch had laughed so hard, he'd knocked his coffee cup. He was letting things in again. She could see it happening, and it wasn't hers to claim credit for, and she was fiercely glad of it anyway. "Mason," she said. He looked over. "There's something in the bag," she said. "The one I carry. You've noticed it, and you haven't asked, and I need you to know what it is before my father gets here, because it changes things." He went very still. "It's documents," she said. "Records. Financial records I took from my father's study the night I left Philadelphia." She watched his face. "He has a contract with Senator Aldrich. The marriage he arranged for me, it wasn't just about politics. There's money involved. Land grants in the Western Territories, rail contracts, federal subsidies. The arrangement was, if I married Aldrich's son, my father got the land. If I didn't—" She stopped. "The documents show exactly what the arrangement was. And they show some other things too. Payments. To territorial officials. To a federal land commissioner in Denver. Things that would be very uncomfortable if they became public." Mason set down the lead line, slowly, like a man being careful not to drop anything. "You took evidence," he said. "I took insurance," she said. "I didn't know what I'd need it for. I only knew I wasn't going to walk into that marriage with nothing." A long silence, the kind that could go either way. "How bad?" he said, at last. "Bad enough," she said, "that he can't afford to let this become a legal dispute. A legal dispute means discovery. Discovery means those documents could come out." She looked at him directly. "Which means if he's coming here himself, he's not coming to fight. He's coming to make this go away quietly. Which means he's going to offer you something significant, and he's going to pressure me, and he's going to try to find whatever will make both of us fold." Mason picked up the lead line again, not because he was going back to the horse just to have something in his hands while he thought. "Does he know you have them?" he said. "He knows I took something," she said. "He's not sure what." "Does anyone else know?" "No one." She paused. "Until now." He looked at her. She let him look. Let him read whatever he needed to read in her face, because there was nothing in it she was hiding from him anymore, and he'd earned that, this careful, quiet man on his mountain who'd put himself between her and her father's machinery twice without being asked. "All right," he said finally. "All right," she said. "We hold on to them," he said. "We don't show them, we don't threaten with them, but we hold on to them." He met her eyes. "Your father's a man who controls things. Takes the control away, and he'll negotiate. If he knows you've got that over him, he'll want to make a deal." She looked at him. "You understand this kind of man." "I understand the typey," he said. "Men who think they own what they own outright and don't reckon on the cost of someone who'd rather burn it down than hand it over." He tipped his head at her. "You're that kind of person, Miss—" He stopped. "Eleanor." Something in her chest tightened at the correction, at the way he'd said her name, just her first name, like it belonged in his mouth. "I am," she said. "I reckon I am." The corner of his mouth moved. "Then we'll be all right." Clarence Whitmore arrived on a Friday. He came with Harold Percy, his man of business, and Frederick Calloway, the Helena lawyer, and two men whose purpose was purely atmospheric, large, silent, expensive-looking. He came in a hired coach that was the finest vehicle Pine Ridge had seen since the territorial governor had passed through 2 years ago. He came, in other words, the way a man comes when he wants to make a point before he said a word. Mason watched the coach roll into the yard from the porch steps. Eleanor stood beside him, half a step back, though he'd noticed that her chin was up and her shoulders were squared, and she was wearing the blue wool dress she'd been married in, which he suspected was not coincidental. Clarence Whitmore stepped out of the coach, and Mason understood immediately several things about Eleanor that he hadn't quite understood before. She had her father's eyes. That same clear, direct measuring quality, the eyes of someone who was always assessing the room and never quite switching it off. The difference was that in her father, the assessment had curdled into something colder. Something that had long ago stopped seeing people and started seeing variables. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of physical presence that came from decades of entering rooms and expecting them to rearrange themselves. He looked at the ranch house, the yard, the land visible beyond, and something moved through his expression that might have been contempt, and might have been just barely surprised that it was more than he'd pictured. Then he looked at Mason. Then he looked at Eleanor. "Eleanor," he said. Not a greeting. A statement of possession, like touching a piece of property to confirm it was still there. "Father," she said. Same flat effect. She'd learned that from him, Mason realized. The perfect surface over whatever was happening underneath. She'd learned it as armor against exactly this. Mason stepped forward. Not far, one deliberate half-step. Enough to reframe the geometry of the moment. "Mr. Whitmore," he said. "Mason Cole, come inside." Whitmore looked at him with the particular expression of a man deciding whether to acknowledge you. He decided to. "Mr. Cole," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that managed to imply he had a great deal to say about Mr. Cole that he was choosing to hold back. "Your men can wait in the yard," Mason said, pleasantly. "Dutch'll get them some water." Percy and the two atmospheric men stayed outside. Calloway, the lawyer, a compact, watchful man with a briefcase, followed Whitmore inside. Eleanor came in behind them, and Mason came last, and the kitchen felt smaller and more charged than it had 20 minutes ago. Mason put the coffee on because that was what you did. Eleanor sat at the table with her hands folded. Whitmore stood near the window, looking at the room with the eyes of a man who found it both smaller and more significant than he'd expected. "I'll say what I came to say," Whitmore said. "There's no point in pretending this is a social call." "Never thought it was," Mason said. He set cups on the table. "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore." Whitmore sat. It seemed to cost him something, but he sat. Calloway sat beside him and opened the briefcase with small, efficient movements. "My daughter left Philadelphia under circumstances that were impulsive," Whitmore said. "She had obligations, commitments that affect more than just herself." "She can speak for herself," Mason said. Whitmore's eyes moved to him. "Indeed, I've found that to be the persistent problem." His tone was dry, but something moved underneath it. Something that might have been in a different man. Something like helpless exasperation. "Eleanor, this ranch, this man, I'm not disputing your right to make choices about your life." "Then we're done here," Eleanor said. "I'm disputing." Whitmore continued, as if she hadn't spoken, the wisdom of choosing on the basis of panic. "It wasn't panic," she said. "It was calculation. You taught me to calculate, Father. You shouldn't be surprised that I learned." A silence settled, heavy. Something was moving in Whitmore's face, something complex, and Mason watched it with the attention he gave to storms on the mountain, reading what was coming. "Frederick," Whitmore said. Calloway slid a document across the table. Mason looked at it without picking it up. "A deed. Land a significant parcel 5 miles south of Pine Ridge, good water access." And a number. Below the deed, a bank draft made out to Mason Cole, $30,000. Mason had known it would be a number that mattered. He hadn't prepared himself for a number that mattered that much. He looked at it for exactly as long as it took to understand what it was. Then he pushed it back. "No," he said. Whitmore looked at him. "You haven't considered?" "I considered it before you walked in," Mason said. "No." "Mr. Cole." Whitmore leaned forward very slightly. "I know what this ranch is worth. I know what it owes. I've done my research." He said it without cruelty, just fact, the way he probably said everything this man who had turned the world into a series of figures to be managed. $30,000 is a great deal of money for a man in your position. "It is," Mason agreed. "Then you understand the offer is generous," Mason said. "Yes and no." Whitmore stared at him. He was a man who had bought his way out of most things for most of his life, and the look on his face was the look of someone who had just run into a wall where he'd expected a door. "You're refusing," he said. "I'm refusing." "On what grounds?" Mason looked at him steadily. "She's my wife," he said. "That's the grounds." "A marriage of convenience," Eleanor said. Both men looked at her. She was looking at her father, and her voice was perfectly controlled, but underneath the control, there was something gathering. "Say it, Father. Say what you're thinking. That he only married me because I needed a shield. That I only came here because I was running. Say it plainly, if you're going to say it." Whitmore looked at his daughter for a long moment. "I'm going to say," he said more quietly, "that I am not your enemy." "Then stop acting like one," she said. The kitchen went quiet. Whitmore sat back. He pressed his fingertips together, a gesture Mason would come to recognize as the way he organized his thoughts when he'd run out of leverage. "The arrangement with Aldrich is still in play," he said. "You understand the value of what you're walking away from." "I understand the cost," she said. "That's not the same thing." "Eleanor, I was not a person in that arrangement," she said. "I was a clause, a condition of transfer." Her voice didn't waver, but something in her eyes had gone very far back to a place where she'd lived with this for a long time. "You negotiated my future the way you negotiate rail contracts, and you expected me to be grateful for the terms." She looked at him. "I am your daughter, not your leverage." Something moved through Clarence Whitmore's face that Mason hadn't expected to see there. It looked like grief. Not manufactured, not strategic, something genuine and old and complicated. The grief of a man who had done something he perhaps could not fully articulate even to himself, who had shaped his child in his own image, and then been surprised when she used every skill he'd given her to walk away from him. The moment was there, and then it was controlled, folded back under the surface, where Whitmore kept things. "Frederick," he said. Calloway reached back into the briefcase. A second document. Mason looked at it. A legal challenge grounds for contestation of the marriage signed and ready to file with the territorial court. "I don't want to do this," Whitmore said. "I want you to understand that." "You're doing it anyway," Eleanor said. "I'm showing you I can," he said. "That's different." "Is it?" She looked at her father with something that was not quite sorrow and not quite anger, and was, Mason thought, the specific exhaustion of someone who had loved a difficult person for a very long time without stopping. "You can contest the marriage. You can bring lawyers and doctors and whatever testimony you've paid for. You can make this very uncomfortable for us both." She paused. "But I have documents, Father." The air in the room changed. Whitmore went very still. "Personal correspondence," she said. "Financial records. Specific records from your study pertaining to the arrangement with Senator Aldrich and its associated components." She held his gaze. "I've read every page. I know what they mean. And I know who would find them meaningful." Calloway's pen had stopped moving. Percy, through the window, was watching the house with the focused attention of a man trying to hear through glass. "Eleanor," Whitmore said, very quietly. "I don't want to use them," she said. Just as quietly. "I want to live my life. I want to be left alone to live it. That's all I've ever wanted from you." Something in her voice cracked just once, barely audible, and then was smooth again. "Just leave me alone to live it." The silence stretched. It was the kind of silence that decisions are made in. Mason sat with his hands around his coffee cup and his eyes on Whitmore. And he did not say a word, because this was not his moment. This was between a father and a daughter, and 30 years of complicated history, and the most useful thing he could do was be a solid presence at this table and not take up more space than that. Whitmore looked at his daughter for a long time. He looked at her the way Mason thought he probably hadn't looked at her in years, not as a variable, not as an asset, not as a problem to be managed, but as a person who had made herself unmistakably real in a way that even Clarence Whitmore's particular genius for abstraction couldn't quite contain. "The documents," Whitmore said, "are safely kept," Eleanor said. "They'll stay that way as long as you don't give me reason to feel otherwise." Another silence. "You won't come home," Whitmore said. It wasn't a question this time. "No." "This." He looked around the kitchen, briefly taking in the account books and the coffee cups and the evidence of a life being built. "This is what you're choosing." "Yes," she said. He looked at Mason. Mason looked back at him without apology, without aggression, without the faintest suggestion that he needed Whitmore's opinion of what was happening at this table. Whitmore stood. He picked up the legal challenge document and folded it and put it in his breast pocket. He picked up the deed and the bank draft and returned them to Calloway. He straightened his jacket with the movements of a man restoring his composure after it had been just briefly disrupted. "You have your mother's stubbornness," he said to Eleanor. "I know," she said. "She was—" He stopped. Whatever he'd been about to say, he didn't say. He put his hat on. "I'll need to renegotiate with Aldrich." "I imagine you will." He moved toward the door. Then he stopped, and without turning around, he said, "If you need anything." He stopped again. "If circumstances change." "I'll know where to find you," Eleanor said. He nodded once. He walked out. The coach door closed, the sound of hooves on the hard-packed yard, and then the road, and then nothing. Eleanor sat at the table for a moment without moving. Then she picked up her coffee cup, found it cold, set it back down. Mason got up and poured her a fresh cup without asking. He set it in front of her. She wrapped her hands around it. Her hands were steady. He didn't know how, but they were. "He won't stop entirely," she said. "He doesn't know how, but he'll look for another angle, a quieter one, and by the time he finds it, we'll—" She stopped. "We'll have made this harder to unwind." "All right," Mason said. She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright, and she was not going to cry. He understood that about her. Now that she held things in the same place. He held things somewhere deep and private, where they processed themselves on their own time. But there was something raw in her face. Something that had been a long time coming. "He called it stubbornness," she said. "What would you call it?" She thought about that for a moment. "Knowing my own mind," she said. Finally, he sat back down across from her and picked up his own cup. Outside, Dutch was already moving around the yard, going back to the ordinary work of the afternoon, as though powerful men came and went on this mountain every day, and the mountain didn't notice. "He looked at you differently," Eleanor said. "At the end, when you refused the money. People usually look at you differently when you do something they didn't expect. Most men would have taken it. Most men haven't spent 4 years finding out what they can do without." He set down his cup. "Money don't replace what money can't buy. Figured that out the hard way." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What does it buy then?" "For you." He looked at her. At the steadiness of her, the careful intelligence, the way she'd sat across from her father and not flinched. At the dirt still caught under her thumbnail from planting the window boxes 2 days ago, which she hadn't quite got clean. "This," he said. Not meaning the ranch or the land or the financial recovery she'd engineered from a kitchen table. Meaning something he wasn't entirely ready to name yet. Meaning what was happening in this kitchen, in this house, in the slow and careful way 2 people who'd both been damaged by loss were finding out what was still left in them. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "This?" she said. Quiet, like she understood exactly what he meant. He nodded. She nodded. They sat with their coffee in the afternoon light, and the house around them felt solid and settled, and entirely different from the house it had been 6 weeks ago, and neither of them said anything else for a while, because there wasn't anything else that needed saying just then. But later that evening, when she was back at the accounts, and he was on the porch in the dark, he heard her voice from inside the house. She was humming something barely audible, low and half-distracted, the kind of sound a person makes when they're not performing for anyone, when they've forgotten for a moment to be careful. He stayed very still so as not to interrupt it. The mountain held the sound, and the night was warm, and somewhere in the barn, the horses moved in their stalls, and Mason Cole sat on his porch and thought, something is changing. He thought it with the same steadiness with which he'd thought everything else that had mattered in his life. He thought something is changing, and I'm going to let it. 3 days after Clarence Whitmore's coach rolled out of the yard, a letter arrived from Helena. It wasn't from Whitmore. It wasn't from Calloway. It was from a man named Arthur Briggs, who identified himself as a correspondent for the Helena Weekly Independent, and who wrote with the cheerful vagueness of a man who believed he was being subtle, that he had received certain information regarding a marriage of interest in Pine Ridge, and wondered if Mr. or Mrs. Cole would care to comment before he published. Mason read it, standing at the kitchen table. Then he handed it to Eleanor without a word. She read it twice. Her jaw tightened, the only external sign she gave. "He's changing tactics," she said. "Newspapers," Mason said. "Newspapers." She set the letter down. "If Calloway can't break the marriage legally, my father will break it socially. A story in the Helena paper gets picked up in Billings, gets picked up in Denver, gets picked up in Philadelphia." She looked at him. "A story that says I'm unstable, that the marriage was fraudulent, that you married me under false pretenses, or that I married you, it damages you, Mason. With every supplier, every bank, every man in this territory who might do business with Cole Ranch." He pulled out a chair and sat down. "What does he want us to do?" "Panic," she said. "He wants us to react. Sue the paper, deny the story, fight back publicly. Every move we make gives him more material." She paced the length of the kitchen 3 steps, turned 3 steps back. It was the first time he'd seen her pace, and it told him more about what was underneath the composure than anything she'd said. Or he wants us to fold, quietly without a scene. He gives us a graceful exit and the story never runs. And if we do nothing, she stopped pacing. Then he prints it, and we live with it. She looked at him steadily. How much does your reputation in Pine Ridge matter to you? Some, he said honestly. But I've been building it for 12 years. One story from Helena doesn't knock that down overnight. It can damage it. A lot of things can damage it. He folded his hands on the table. What do you want to do? She looked at him. The question seemed to land differently than she'd expected it to, like she'd been waiting for him to tell her what they were going to do, and instead he'd handed it back to her. I want to be done being managed, she said. Then don't write back to Briggs, Mason said. And don't write back to your father. Let the silence do the work. She looked at him for a long moment. That's a risk. Most things worth doing are. He got up and poured himself a second cup of coffee. Your father's a man who fills silence with his own voice. If we don't give him anything to push against, he'll push at air. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. He came here himself, Eleanor. Men who have the situation in hand don't come themselves. He came because you surprised him. Keep surprising him. She stood with that for a moment. Then she crossed to the table and picked up the letter and walked to the small iron stove and opened the door and put the letter in. All right, she said, watching it catch. The flames took it in about 6 seconds. She shut the stove door and went back to the accounts. Mason drank his coffee and didn't say anything else because there wasn't anything else to say, and because she didn't need him to fill the silence. But he watched her for a moment, that straight back, those steady hands, the way she went back to work. The way she went back to work after everything, like she'd made her decision, and the decision was behind her now. And he thought that he had somewhere. In the last weeks, stopped seeing her as the woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach with someone else's trouble following her. He'd started seeing her as his, not his property, not his obligation. Something different. Something that had grown in quiet, and without announcement, the way the lavender in the window boxes had put up its first thin green shoots without him noticing until they were already there. He put his coffee cup down and went out to work, and he took that thought with him and didn't try to put it away. The Helena Weekly Independent ran the story on a Thursday. Dutch brought the paper up from town folded under his arm, his face carefully blank in the way Dutch's face went blank when he was managing bad news. He found Mason in the barn and set it on the fence rail without a word. Mason read the headline. Disputed marriage in Pine Ridge, Eastern heiress, and mountain rancher draw scrutiny. Below it 2 columns of the kind of prose that managed to suggest everything, while technically asserting nothing, full of phrases like sources close to the Whitmore family. And questions have been raised, and the circumstances surrounding the rapid union have led some observers to wonder. It quoted no one by name. It proved nothing. It implied everything. Mason read it through once, folded it, and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he went back to what he'd been doing. 20 minutes later, Eleanor appeared in the barn doorway. She had flour on her hands, she'd been working on something in the kitchen, and she was holding a second copy of the paper that she'd clearly gotten from somewhere else. Mrs. Oakes sent it up with the supply boy, she said, with a note. What did the note say? That she wanted me to know before someone said something unkind in her store. Eleanor's voice was dry, but something underneath it wasn't. She also sent a jar of her apple preserves. She said she didn't know if it would help, but she thought it might not hurt. Mason looked at her. How are you? She considered the question the way she considered everything, directly, without evasion. Angry, she said. Embarrassed. Not because it's true. Because it's there and people I don't know are reading it and drawing conclusions about my character, and I can't. She stopped. I can't respond to it. I know that. But the inability to respond is its own particular kind of... She stopped again. Humiliation, Mason said. Yes. She said it quietly, like it cost something. He came out of the stall and took the paper from her hand and folded it on top of the one already in his pocket. "Come with me," he said. "Where?" "Town." She looked at him. "Mason?" "Not to fight," he said. "Not to respond, just to be seen." He looked at her steadily. "Your father's betting we'll hide, so we won't hide." They went to Pine Ridge that afternoon, together. Mason drove the wagon, and Eleanor sat beside him, and she was wearing the blue wool dress again. That dress that was becoming, he realized, her armor. And when they pulled up to the Mercantile and climbed down the afternoon crowd on the main street, had that particular quality of people who've already been talking about you and have not yet decided how to behave when you appear in front of them. Mason tipped his hat to Marjorie Hatch. Eleanor walked into the Mercantile and ordered 6 months of household supplies and discussed the quality of the new flour shipment with the clerk and asked after his mother's health. At the dry goods, she complimented Mrs. Oakes on the apple preserves and said she hoped to learn the recipe when Mrs. Oakes had time. And Mrs. Oakes looked at Eleanor Whitmore Cole and then looked at the doorway where Mason was standing and said, "That article was a disgrace. And I've told 3 people this morning exactly what I think of newspapers that print other people's business dressed up as news." By the time they drove back up the mountain, 4 women had said some version of that to Eleanor's face, and 2 men had shaken Mason's hand in a way that said more than a handshake usually did. "You've built something here," Eleanor said on the road home, "with these people." "Takes a while," he said, "but it holds." She was quiet for a moment. "My father spent 40 years building something in Philadelphia," she said. "He built it out of contracts and leverage and what people owed him." She watched the road. "You built this out of something else." "What's that?" "Showing up," she said simply. "Just being the man you are consistently over time." She said it like she was figuring something out as she said it. "People trust you because you never gave them a reason not to." He drove in silence for a bit. "Your father's people have been talking to someone in Pine Ridge," he said. She looked at him sharply. "How do you know?" "The story had details," he said. "The account books, the Calhoun dispute, things that aren't public." He kept his eyes on the road. Somebody close to the ranch talked. The silence that followed was a different quality from any silence they'd shared before. Tighter, more particular. "Dutch," she said. She didn't want to say it, but she said it. "No," he said without hesitation. "Not Dutch." "Then who?" "Tom Brierly," he said. "The supply hand. He's been coming up twice a week since March. He's been in the kitchen when you work. He heard things." Mason's voice was even, but something underneath it wasn't. "I let him go this morning." Eleanor looked at him. "You already knew, before we went to town." "Found out last night." "You didn't tell me. Didn't want it to change how you carried yourself in town." He glanced at her. "I needed you walking into that Mercantile like a woman who had nothing to be ashamed of, not a woman who'd just found out she'd been listened to." She sat with that for a moment. The care of it. The specific quiet way he'd thought of her. Not her safety, not her reputation in the abstract, but her experience of that afternoon, the particular dignity of it. "I don't need protecting from information," she said, carefully because she didn't want to be angry at the wrong thing. "No," he agreed. "You don't. I was wrong to hold it back." He said it without defense. "Won't do it again." She nodded. "All right." A pause. "Thank you for telling me now." "Yeah." They drove the rest of the way home in quiet, and it was the uncomplicated kind. The second twist came from a direction neither of them had anticipated. It came from Aldrich. Not Senator Aldrich, his son. Thomas Aldrich, 24 years old, whom Eleanor had never met, but whose name she knew from every document she'd removed from her father's study. Thomas Aldrich arrived in Pine Ridge 11 days after the Helena article ran alone without his father's men in ordinary traveling clothes, and he asked at the stage office how to find the Cole Ranch. Mason was in the yard when the young man came up the road on a rented horse, and he stood and watched him come with the particular stillness that meant he was already deciding things. Thomas Aldrich was younger than he'd expected. lean, dark-eyed, with the look of someone who'd been well cared for his whole life and was not entirely comfortable with that fact. He pulled up and looked at Mason and said with less authority than a man with his background usually had, "Mr. Cole, my name is Thomas Aldrich. I need to speak with Eleanor." "What about?" Mason said. "About the arrangement our fathers made." He met Mason's eyes. It took some effort, Mason could tell, but he held it. "I want her to know." He stopped, started again. "I didn't know about the documents. My father didn't tell me what he and Mr. Whitmore had built into the contract. I found out." He stopped once more. "I found out 2 weeks ago, and I think she deserves to know what I know." Mason looked at him for a long 10 seconds. Then he called into the house. Eleanor came to the door, looked at Thomas Aldrich, and went very still. "Miss Whitmore," the young man said. "Mrs. Cole," she said automatically, but without the steel she'd used with Graves and Percy. She was reading him the way she read everything, and something in what she read made her come down off the porch. "Come inside," she said. Mason brought coffee. He sat at the table because Eleanor had not asked him to leave, and he had no intention of leaving, and Thomas Aldrich sat across from her and told her what he'd come to say. The arrangement was worse than Eleanor had known. She'd taken the financial documents, the land grants, the rail contracts, the payments to the territorial officials. What she hadn't known, because it was kept in a separate correspondence her father conducted entirely by cipher, was the larger structure underneath it. Aldrich Sr. and Whitmore weren't just exchanging a daughter for land rights. They were building a political machine. The marriage was meant to create a permanent alliance between two family power bases: Aldrich's Senate connections and Whitmore's Western Railroad reach that would control federal land grants in 6 territories over the next decade. Senators, governors, contracts worth millions, and Eleanor, by leaving, had cracked the foundation of it. "My father is furious," Thomas Aldrich said. He said it without satisfaction. "He's been telling yours that the whole arrangement falls apart without the marriage to anchor it, that without the family connection, there's no reason to trust the partnership." He looked at his coffee cup. "My father has been," he seemed to choose his words carefully, "he has been telling me I need to come and persuade you to come home, to make this right." Eleanor looked at him. "And instead, you came to tell me what they're planning." "Yes," he said simply. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because I was engaged to marry a person, not a clause in a contract, and I was told you were—" He stopped, swallowed. "They told me you were agreeable, that the arrangement was mutual, that you understood your role in it." He looked up at her. "When I read my father's actual correspondence, I understood that wasn't true, and He pressed his lips together. "I wouldn't have agreed to it if I'd known. I want you to know that." Eleanor looked at him for a long time. Mason watched her read the young man, calibrating, checking for the angle, the deception, the hidden purpose, and watched her find none. "I believe you," she said. Thomas Aldrich let out a breath. "There's more," he said. "My father is going to increase the pressure on yours. If Mr. Whitmore can't deliver the marriage, the partnership breaks, and my father will go public with certain information about your father's railroad dealings that well." He looked at Mason. "The documents Mrs. Cole took aren't the only ones that exist. My father has his own copies, and he's prepared to use them to ruin Whitmore if Whitmore can't hold up his end." The kitchen was very quiet. Eleanor said, "My father is being threatened." "Yes." "And he's responding by threatening us." "Yes." "Because he needs this resolved before Aldrich runs out of patience." "Yes," Thomas Aldrich said. "You have—" He seemed uncomfortable. "You have, I think, a matter of weeks before this escalates into something public and significant. My father will act, and when he does, the fallout will involve everyone whose name appears in those documents, including yours." He looked at his hands. "I came because I thought you deserved to know. And because—" He paused. "I won't be party to what they're doing. I've told my father I'm withdrawing from the arrangement. He's not pleased." Something flickered across his face. But I find I'd rather be not pleased him than the other thing." He left an hour later back down the mountain on his rented horse, and Mason stood on the porch and watched him go, and Eleanor stood beside him. "He's braver than I expected," she said. "He's young enough to think courage solves things," Mason said. "Sometimes it does." She looked at him. "You don't think it's enough?" "I think we need something more than brave," he said. "I think we need smart." He looked at her. "You've been smart from the first night. What does smart say about this?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. A real quiet, the kind where the thinking was actually happening. "The documents I have," she said slowly, "are enough to protect us from my father directly. But Thomas is right that if Aldrich moves first, the fallout doesn't stay contained." She looked at the road where the young man had disappeared. "We can't wait for this to come at us. We need to put the whole thing somewhere neither of them can touch it." "A lawyer," Mason said. "Not just a lawyer." She turned to him. "A federal official, someone with authority over rail contracts and land grants." She was working it through as she spoke. He could see the pieces moving behind her eyes. "If the documents are in the right hands before either Aldrich or my father can act, the entire political arrangement falls apart, not because of a family scandal, but because of a federal inquiry." She looked at him. "They've been paying territorial commissioners, Mason. That's a federal crime. If the right person sees those papers, they go after them instead of us," he said. "Exactly." He thought about that, about what it meant sending those documents out of her hands, out of their hands, into a process neither of them could control once it started. "Are you sure?" he said. She met his eyes. "I've been carrying those papers for 6 months," she said. "I've been carrying them as insurance, as protection. But they're not protection, they're a target. As long as I have them, my father has a reason to come after me." She held his gaze. "I want to be done being a target, Mason." "Once it's done, he said. "There's no getting ahead of it. I know. It'll be messy. There'll be a federal inquiry. Your father's name will be in it." "I know," she said again. Something moved through her face, that old grief, that complicated love for a man who had spent her whole life treating her as a resource. "He made his choices. I'm making mine." Mason nodded. "All right. I know a man in Bozeman. Served with him in the cavalry. He works for the Territorial Attorney General's office now." He paused. "He's honest." "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He looked at her. "I'll ride out tomorrow." She put her hand on his arm. It was brief, just a moment, just a touch, and then her hand was back at her side. But he felt it the way you feel a thing that matters all the way to the center of his chest. "Together," she said. "I'll ride with you." They left before dawn. Dutch knew. Dutch always knew, and he didn't ask questions, and when Mason went to the barn at 4 a.m, Dutch was already there with both horses saddled and his face carrying the look of a man who has spent 11 years being ready for things. "Back by nightfall," Dutch said. "Tomorrow morning," Mason said. Dutch nodded. He looked at Eleanor, who was adjusting the satchel over her shoulder. That bag, the one she'd carried since Philadelphia, the one that had been the weight of everything she'd been carrying. Dutch looked at it, and then at her face, with the expression of a man who understood more than he was given credit for. "Ride safe," he said. They rode south on the mountain road in the dark, and then into the first gray light of morning, and the world was quiet and enormous around them, and Eleanor rode well better than he'd expected, though he wasn't sure why he'd expected otherwise. After an hour, she said, "Tell me about your friend in Bozeman." "Daniel Cross," Mason said. "Known him since the war. He's a careful man, careful about what's right. Spent 20 years being careful about it." He kept his eyes on the road. "He'll do the right thing with what you give him." "You trust him?" "Completely." She considered that. "How many people do you trust completely?" He thought about it. "Dutch," he said. "Betty. Daniel." He paused. You. She looked at him sideways. He was watching the road, and he felt the look more than he saw it. That's a short list, she said. Quality over quantity, he said. She almost laughed. He heard it, that breath of sound she made when something surprised her into amusement. He'd come to listen for it. He wasn't examining that too closely. They were 2 hours south of Pine Ridge when they stopped to water the horses at a creek, and that was when Eleanor opened the satchel. She'd had it with her every waking moment since Philadelphia. He'd never seen her open it, not once, in all the weeks she'd been on the ranch, had she opened that bag in front of anyone. She took out what she needed, a sealed envelope she'd prepared the night before, thick with documents tied with cord and sealed with wax. She held it in both hands for a moment. 6 months. She said to the envelope more than to him. 6 months I carried this, and told myself it was safety. She looked up. It wasn't safety. It was a chain. Just one I'd put on myself. Mason didn't say anything. She wasn't talking to him. Not really, she was talking to herself, working something through that needed to be worked through. She put the envelope back in the satchel and closed it. All right, she said. Let's go. No. Daniel Cross was a compact, precise man with reading glasses and an office that looked like a controlled landslide of documents. He had the manner of someone who had heard a great many things and was not surprised by any of them, and when Mason walked in and said, "I need you to hear something," he took off his glasses and said, "Sit down," and meant it. Eleanor told him everything. She was organized and sequential, and she did not editorialize. She laid out the structure. Whitmore Aldrich. The arrangement: the land grants the payments to the territorial commissioner in Denver, and she produced the documents one by one from the envelope with the methodical efficiency of a woman who had organized her case before she'd arrived. Cross did not interrupt. He read each document as she produced it. His face gave nothing away, which Mason recognized as the face of a man who had been in the law long enough to know that his reaction was a form of power, and he wasn't going to hand it out cheaply. When Eleanor finished, Cross picked up the last document and held it for a moment. Then he set it down. "Mrs. Cole," he said, "how many people know you have these?" "My husband," she said, "and one other person who came to me of his own accord." "Aldrich's son," Mason said. Cross looked at Mason. "He's volunteering." "He's done with the arrangement," Mason said. "Whether he'll stand up formally." He shrugged. "He will," Eleanor said. Both men looked at her. "He came 1,200 miles to tell me the truth when he didn't have to," she said. "He'll stand up." Cross took his glasses off and cleaned them, which Mason knew was something Daniel Cross did when he was thinking very fast and needed somewhere to put his hands. If these documents are what they appear to be, and they appear to be exactly what they appear to be, we are looking at violations of the Federal Land Grant Act, bribery of a territorial official, and conspiracy to defraud the federal government of contracted survey rights. He put his glasses back on. "Mrs. Cole, I need to ask you something directly." "Ask it," she said. "Your father's name is on these documents. Whatever comes next, his name will be in a federal inquiry. There is no way to limit that." He looked at her over his glasses. "Is that something you've made peace with?" Eleanor sat with that question for a moment. Mason sat beside her and did not move. "My father," she said slowly, "is not a man who will be destroyed by this. He has enough money, enough lawyers, enough influence, that a federal inquiry will cost him significantly, but not absolutely." She looked at Cross. "I'm not trying to destroy him. I'm trying to make it so that destroying me stops being worth his time." She held the lawyer's gaze. "What I want is for this to be in the hands of someone he can't buy, so that he has to weigh what it costs him to keep coming after us against what it costs him if these documents are examined further. I want the calculation to stop working in his favor." Cross looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Mason. "You married well," he said. Mason said, "I know." Something moved across Eleanor's face, fast, private. something she didn't quite catch in time. Cross gathered the documents. "I'll need 2 days. I have a contact in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Denver who needs to be the first call." He looked up. "You two should not be in Bozeman when I make it." "We'll head back tonight," Mason said. "And if your father's people show up before this moves—" Cross looked at Eleanor. "Then we make it harder for them," she said. "We've done that before." Cross almost smiled. "I believe you have." He stood. He put his hand out to Eleanor first, which Mason noted. "Mrs. Cole." She shook it. "Mr. Cross?" "I'll be in touch within the week." He looked at Mason. "You've got a good one, Mason." "I know," Mason said again. They rode out of Bozeman in the late afternoon and made camp on the road when the dark came too thick for the horses, and Mason built a small fire, and Eleanor sat across from him with the satchel empty in her lap. Flat now, light, just leather, and she turned it over in her hands and said nothing for a long while. "How does it feel?" he said. She looked up. "Strange," she said. "Like I've been braced for so long I don't remember how to not be braced." She looked at the empty bag. "Like I've been running for so long I don't know what I look like standing still." He looked at her across the fire. "What do you see?" She looked up. "What? When you imagine stopping," he said. "Standing still. What do you see?" She was quiet. The fire moved between them. Somewhere in the dark, a nighthawk called. "Montana," she said at last. Quiet, like it surprised her. "The window boxes, the account books in the morning, Dutch's terrible jokes at supper." She paused. "You sitting on the porch in the dark." He held her gaze. The fire was between them, and the dark was around them, and the mountain was enormous and indifferent above them both, and everything was very still. "Then that's what you run toward," he said. "Not what you're running from." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face was coming apart very slowly, at the edges, not breaking, but opening. The way things open when they've been held shut for a long time, and the reason for holding them shuts lifts. "Mason," she said. "Yeah. I think—" She stopped. "I think I need to say something." "All right. I think I came here for practical reasons," she said. "Honest, practical reasons. And I think somewhere in the last weeks it stopped being practical." She held his gaze. "And I don't know what to do with that." He was quiet for a moment. The fire popped. The nighthawk called again. "You don't have to do anything with it," he said. "It can just be true." "That's not very—" She started. "Practical," he said. Something in her broke loose completely. Then, just for a moment, just a flash of it, and she laughed. A real laugh, the kind he'd been waiting 11 weeks to hear, full and unguarded and entirely her own. He felt it like the first morning in spring when the cold finally breaks. Like something that had been waiting a long time to be warm again. He didn't say what he was feeling. Not yet. Some things needed the right moment, and this was a campfire in the dark on a mountain road, which was not nothing but also was not yet the moment. But he thought it. Clearly, without flinching, the way he'd thought all the things that mattered. He thought, "I'm in love with my wife." He thought it, and he let it be true. "Get some sleep," he said. "Long ride tomorrow." She smiled at him. Still open at the edges. Still that rare, unguarded version of herself. "Yes, husband," she said dryly, and rolled herself in her blanket. He sat up by the fire a while longer, keeping watch the way he always did. And the mountain held them in its darkness, and somewhere to the north, the ranch was waiting with its window boxes and its accounts, and its east room that had been closed a long time. And Mason Cole sat by his fire and thought about running toward things, about how different it felt from running away. They got back to the ranch the next morning to find Dutch standing in the yard with his arms crossed and a look on his face that meant something had happened while they were gone. "Federal Marshal was here," Dutch said before Mason had even climbed down from his horse. "Yesterday afternoon. Name of Garrett. Said he'd come back." Mason and Eleanor looked at each other. "That was fast," Eleanor said. Cross moves quick when he has reason to, Mason said. He climbed down and handed Dutch the reins. What did he want? Wouldn't say. Just left his card and said he'd return this morning. Dutch looked at Eleanor with something careful in his expression. He also said your father's lawyer filed something in the territorial court in Helena yesterday, before the marshal showed up. He paused. I don't know what exactly. But the supply boy from town brought word that people are talking. Eleanor was off her horse before Dutch finished speaking. She walked straight into the house, straight to the kitchen table, and sat down with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes on the middle distance working through it. Mason came in behind her. He didn't sit. He stood by the door and gave her the space to think, because he'd learned that was what she needed when something new landed, room to move around it, map its edges, find its shape. He filed before Cross could move, she said. Looks like. He had someone watching Cross's office. She pressed her lips together. Or watching us. He knew we went to Bozeman. She looked up. How much time does the court filing buy him? Depends what he filed, Mason said. If it's the competency challenge, he's asking the court to declare you legally unable to manage your own affairs. That gets him guardianship. Guardianship supersedes the marriage. He said it plainly because she needed plain. It's the same tactic he threatened in July, but this time he's actually done it. Eleanor absorbed that. He's moving because he knows Cross has the documents. He's trying to get legal control of me before a federal inquiry can establish that I acted in good faith. If you're declared incompetent, anything you took from his study becomes property taken by someone who can't be held legally responsible for it. Mason came to the table and sat down across from her. It also means anything you say in a legal proceeding can be challenged on the basis of your capacity. He's trying to silence me before I can speak, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Just a moment. Then she sat up straighter and her jaw set in that particular way it set when she was done processing and had arrived somewhere. Then I need to speak first, she said. Marshal Garrett arrived at 9 in the morning, as Dutch had said he would. He was a lean, weathered man in his 40s with a federal badge and the economical manners of someone who'd spent 20 years dealing with complicated situations and had stopped being surprised by any of them. He shook Mason's hand and tipped his hat to Eleanor and accepted coffee, and he sat at the kitchen table and laid out what he knew in the same unhurried way he probably laid everything out. Daniel Cross had contacted the U.S. Attorney's office in Denver. The U.S. Attorney had contacted the Department of the Interior, which had jurisdiction over federal land grants. The department had assigned Garrett to establish initial contact with the parties involved and to secure any documentary evidence pending a formal inquiry. The documents you provided to Mr. Cross, Garrett said to Eleanor, are now in federal custody. That protects them and you. He looked at her steadily. It also means they're out of your hands. You understand that? I understand it, she said. There's a complication. Garrett set down his coffee cup. Your father's attorney filed a petition for conservatorship in the territorial court in Helena yesterday at 4 o'clock. Judge Alderman has accepted it for hearing. Alderman, Mason said. Garrett looked at him. You know him. Know of him, Mason said. His name appeared in the Helena paper 2 years ago in connection with a land dispute. He ruled in favor of the Northern Rail interest. He held Garrett's gaze. Against a homesteader who had a strong case. Garrett's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. I'll note that, he said. The hearing, Eleanor said. When? 3 weeks from Thursday. Can it be challenged? The jurisdiction. A competency petition under territorial law sits with the territorial court, Garrett said. The federal inquiry doesn't automatically supersede it. They're parallel proceedings. He looked at her directly. Mrs. Cole, I need to tell you something honestly. The federal case is strong. Given what's in those documents, your father and Aldrich Sr. are looking at significant federal exposure. But that process takes time, months, possibly more than a year before formal charges. The territorial hearing is in 3 weeks. He paused. If Judge Alderman rules against you before the federal case is established, it creates a legal situation that becomes complicated to unwind. The kitchen was very quiet. He's saying the hearing matters, Mason said. The hearing matters enormously, Garrett said. If she goes into that hearing without strong representation and the judge is, he chose his word, predisposed, the outcome may not reflect the facts. Eleanor looked at Garrett. Are you telling me to be afraid? I'm telling you to be prepared, he said. There's a difference. She nodded slowly. Then she said, Is Thomas Aldrich's willingness to testify something the federal inquiry knows about? Garrett's eyebrows moved slightly. We were not aware of that. He came to us, Mason said. Voluntarily. He repudiated the arrangement. Garrett reached into his coat for a notebook. I'll need to speak with him. He's in Bozeman, Eleanor said. Staying at the Grand Hotel. He told me himself. Garrett wrote that down. He closed the notebook and looked at Eleanor with something that was close to respect. You're well organized for someone who's been managing this alone. I haven't been alone, she said. She said it simply without looking at Mason, and Mason felt it land in his chest, the way things landed there, now cleanly without resistance. The lawyer's name was James Whitfield, and Dutch had recommended him, which meant Mason trusted him on instinct before the man had said a single word. Whitfield was 60. Heavyset, with the deliberate manner of someone who had stopped moving fast 30 years ago and found that moving slowly got better results. He arrived at the ranch 2 days after Garrett's visit, listened to Eleanor for 2 hours without interrupting, and then sat back in his chair and said, They're going to call witnesses. What kind of witnesses? Eleanor said. Character witnesses. People who'll testify that your behavior has been erratic, irrational, potentially delusional. He looked at her over his glasses. Has your behavior in anyone's presence since you arrived in Montana been anything that could be characterized that way? No, Eleanor said. Whitfield looked at Mason. No, Mason said. Good. Whitfield made a note. They'll also try to establish that the marriage was entered into under coercion, that Mr. Cole used your vulnerability to his advantage. He paused. I want to know from both of you whether there's anything in the history of this arrangement that could be made to look like that. Anything at all. Mason and Eleanor looked at each other. He called himself her husband in the street before he'd spoken to her for 5 minutes, Dutch said from where he'd been standing by the door. Both lawyers and both Coles looked at him. He shrugged, unapologetic. Thought you should know. The whole town saw it. Whitfield looked at Mason. Is that accurate? It is, Mason said. Why? Mason looked at Whitfield steadily. Because a man had just appeared and started talking about her like she owed him something, he said. And it was the most direct way to make clear she didn't. Whitfield studied him. That's either going to read as impulsive and suspicious, he said, or as protective and clear-headed. Depends on how it's presented. He made another note. We'll present it the second way. He looked at Eleanor. You need to be willing to testify. I know. They will try to unsettle you, he said. Calloway is good. He'll try to make your emotional responses the evidence. He held her gaze. The fact that you left Philadelphia, that you traveled alone, that you entered into a rapid marriage, any one of those things can be made to look like instability. Together, they build a pattern, if the jury wants to see one. It isn't a jury proceeding, Eleanor said. No, Whitfield said. It's Judge Alderman. He said the name with the careful neutrality of a man who had opinions he was professionally obligated to keep contained. Which is why what we argue matters more than how many people we put on the stand. He looked at her. Mrs. Cole, I want you to understand what I'm going to argue. Tell me, she said. I'm not going to argue that you're not unstable, he said. I'm going to argue that it doesn't matter. He held up one hand before she could respond. The competency petition rests on your father's claim that you lack the capacity to make rational decisions about your own welfare. I'm going to argue that every decision you've made since leaving Philadelphia was rational, documented, and demonstrably in your own interest. That you managed household accounts efficiently, renegotiated fraudulent supplier contracts, corresponded appropriately with legal parties, and assisted in turning over evidence of federal crimes. He paused. I'm going to make the argument about your choices, not your character. Because your choices are defensible in a way that character testimony never fully is. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She stopped. That's exactly right, she said. That's exactly the right argument. Whitfield nodded. I've been doing this 40 years, he said mildly. Now, tell me everything about the Calhoun account. So, the hearing was set for a Thursday, the 2 weeks before it moved with the particular quality of time that is both too fast and too slow, days filled with preparation that felt urgent and necessary, and nights that felt stretched and hollow in the way that nights before important things always did. Whitfield came to the ranch 3 times. He drilled Eleanor on her testimony with the methodical persistence of someone who believed that preparation was the difference between justice and its opposite. He drilled Mason too, which Mason submitted to with the patience he brought to difficult horses, steady, without resistance, trusting the process. On the evening before they left for Helena, Eleanor found Mason on the porch. She sat down beside him. Not at the far end of the bench the way she might have 2 months ago, but close enough that their shoulders were almost touching. He noticed. He didn't move away. Tell me something true, she said. He looked at her sideways. What kind of true? Something that has nothing to do with federal inquiries or territorial courts or my father. She looked at her hands. Something ordinary. He thought about it. Dutch's mare is going to foal in about 3 weeks, he said. He's been checking on her every 4 hours. I don't think he's slept properly since September. She almost smiled. What else? The east pasture fence came down in last week's wind. We fixed it in about 2 hours, which is 40 minutes faster than last time because you suggested we change the post spacing in June, and I didn't listen until last month. He paused. You were right about the post spacing. I know, she said. You usually don't say so. I'm trying to be better about that. He glanced at her. She was looking out at the dark, and there was something in her face that was tired but not beaten, wrung out at the edges in the specific way of someone who had been carrying something large for a long time and was almost at the place where they could set it down. Mason, she said. Yeah, whatever happens tomorrow, she stopped. Whatever happens in that courtroom, I need you to know that She stopped again. Something was working in her face, something she was trying to say, and hadn't quite assembled the right words for which was unusual enough for Eleanor that it was its own kind of revelation. I know, he said. She looked at him. You don't know what I was going to say. I know enough of it, he said. He turned on the bench, so he was facing her more directly. In the dark, her eyes were very clear, that same clear measuring quality, except that right now they weren't measuring anything. They were just looking at him. I know that you came here for practical reasons and it turned into something else. I know that you're the most capable person I've put on this ranch in 12 years, and that's not what I noticed first. He held her gaze. I know that I stopped worrying about the accounts about 3 weeks ago, and started worrying about whether you were sleeping enough, which is a different kind of concern. She was very still. I know, he said quietly, that the house is different now, and that He stopped because some things needed to be said carefully, and he was a man who had not said things carefully in a long time. I don't want it to go back to what it was. Mason, she said, very quiet. You don't have to say anything, he said. Not tonight, not before all of this. I just wanted you to know where I stood. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached over and took his hand. Not a dramatic gesture, just her hand over his, steady and deliberate, the way she did everything, and she held it. I know where I stand, she said. I've known for a while. They sat like that on the porch, until the night got cold, and Mason Cole felt for the first time in 4 years that the house behind him was a place he was glad to be leaving and glad to be coming back to, which was what a home was supposed to feel like, which was something he'd stopped believing he'd feel again. He'd been wrong about that. He was glad to be wrong. Helena in October was gray-skied and sharp-aired, and the territorial courthouse sat at the end of the main street with the heavy solemnity of a building that took itself seriously. They arrived the evening before and took rooms at the hotel, and Whitfield met them in the lobby with a face that was professionally calm and told Mason everything he needed to know. "Calloway has 4 witnesses," Whitfield said, "a physician from Philadelphia who will testify about Eleanor's—" He paused. "Her state of mind when she left. A woman who knew her socially, who will speak to certain behavior at a social function 2 years ago. Harold Percy, who was present in Pine Ridge." He paused again. "And Clarence Whitmore." Eleanor beside Mason didn't move. "Her father is testifying," Mason said. "He's the petitioner's primary witness," Whitfield said. "His testimony will be that Eleanor's behavior has been irrational since I stopped doing what he wanted," Eleanor said. Her voice was even. "Since I stopped being useful in the way he needed me to be useful." Whitfield looked at her. "Yes," he said, "that's what his testimony will amount to, and that is exactly how I intend to reframe it." He held her gaze. "But you need to be ready to be in the same room as him, ready for him to say difficult things on the stand." "I've been in rooms with my father my whole life," Eleanor said. "I know how to be in a room with him." "This is different," Whitfield said. "I know," she said, "but I'm still ready." Whitfield looked at Mason. Mason gave him a small nod that said she means it. Whitfield nodded back. "Get some sleep," he said. "Both of you." Neither of them did particularly. But morning came anyway the way it always did, indifferent to whether you were ready. The courtroom was smaller than Eleanor had expected, and more formal than the ranch had prepared her for. She walked in beside Mason and felt the particular quality of a room that contained people who had opinions about her before she'd opened her mouth, and she did what she always did with rooms like that. She assessed it, mapped it, and walked through it with her chin level and her back straight. Calloway was already at the plaintiff's table. He was a smooth man, mid-40s, with the careful grooming of someone who understood that appearance was argument. He watched Eleanor take her seat with the focused attention of an opponent, making final calculations. Her father sat behind him. He met Eleanor's eyes when she came in. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, and then looked at Whitfield, and that was the only acknowledgement she gave him. Judge Alderman was 60-something with a face that revealed very little, and a manner that revealed slightly more the manner of a man who had already formed preliminary opinions and was waiting to see if you'd change them. Not hostile, not friendly, watchful. Calloway opened with what Whitfield had predicted, a methodical construction of a narrative in which a young woman of delicate temperament had made impulsive decisions under stress, had entered into an irregular arrangement with a stranger, and had placed herself in a situation in which she was not equipped to manage her own interests. He was good. Mason sat beside Eleanor and listened to a version of her that he did not recognize, assembled piece by piece out of true facts rearranged to mean something they didn't mean, and he kept his hands flat on his knees and his face even. Eleanor watched Calloway with the expression of someone watching a process they understand and are not alarmed by. When Calloway finished his opening, Whitfield stood. "Your Honor," he said, "I intend to demonstrate that Mrs. Cole's decisions since leaving Philadelphia have been rational, deliberate, and consistently in her own interest. That she managed financial operations more effectively than they had been managed previously. That she identified and corrected fraudulent business practices. That she provided material assistance to a federal inquiry into crimes of significant public importance." He paused. "And that her father's petition is not about her welfare, but about his." Alderman looked at Whitfield over his glasses. Something shifted in the watchful expression. He said, "Proceed." Calloway's physician was first. He testified that Eleanor had been, in his professional opinion, in a state of significant emotional distress in the months prior to her departure. Whitfield's cross-examination was brief and surgical. Doctor, did Mrs. Cole ever harm herself or anyone else during the period you observed her? No, but did she fail to fulfill her social or professional obligations? There were incidents of it, yes or no, doctor. No. Did she express beliefs that were disconnected from reality? A pause. Not precisely, but thank you. The social acquaintance was next. She testified about an incident at a dinner party. Eleanor had argued with her father in front of guests, had raised her voice, had been asked to leave the room. Whitfield looked at his notes. Mrs. Harrington, did Mrs. Cole argue with her father about something specific? It was, yes, there was a disagreement. What was the disagreement about? Calloway was on his feet. Objection. Relevance. Whitfield turned to the judge. It is entirely relevant, Your Honor, whether the substance of Mrs. Cole's argument was rational. Alderman looked at the witness. Answer the question. Mrs. Harrington looked uncomfortable. It was about Mr. Whitmore had announced the engagement at the dinner without... She stopped. Without informing his daughter in advance, Whitfield said. Yes. So Mrs. Cole argued with her father about an engagement she had not been informed of and had not agreed to. Whitfield paused. Is that the incident you characterized as evidence of instability? The silence that followed was its own answer. Percy was next. He testified to Eleanor's behavior in Pine Ridge, arriving alone, the encounter with Mason, her manner. Whitfield established through careful questioning that Percy had been sent specifically to intercept Eleanor, that he had no independent reason to be in Montana, and that his observations were those of a man employed to bring her back. Mr. Percy, you work for Clarence Whitmore. I do. And Mr. Whitmore sent you to Pine Ridge to find his daughter, to locate her and ensure her safe. He sent you to bring her back. To assist her in returning, Mr. Percy. Whitfield's voice was mild. Did Mrs. Cole express a desire to return with you? She was. Did she say yes or no? No, Percy said. Thank you. Then Clarence Whitmore took the stand. Eleanor sat very still. Mason reached under the table and put his hand over hers briefly, and she turned her hand over and gripped his once and then let go. Whitmore testified in the composed, measured manner of a man who had given depositions before and understood that the witness stand was its own kind of negotiation. He spoke about his daughter with what appeared to be genuine concern about her distress, her impulsiveness, his fear for her safety. He was, Mason thought, a better witness than he'd expected because some of the concern was real. The man did love his daughter in his particular, complicated, proprietary way. Whitfield let him speak. Let Calloway walk him through the full account. Then Whitfield stood. Mr. Whitmore, you are asking this court to grant you conservatorship of your daughter. I'm asking the court to ensure her welfare. Conservatorship, Whitfield said. The legal right to make decisions about her life and property on her behalf. Is that what you're asking for? If that's what's required, yes or no? Yes, Whitmore said. And if that conservatorship were granted, you would have the legal authority to dissolve her marriage. If that were in her best, yes or no? Whitmore's jaw tightened. Potentially, yes. You would also have the authority to determine where she lives. Yes. And with whom? Yes. And you would have authority over any documents she holds or controls. A pause, a fraction longer than the others. Yes, Whitmore said, including documents she may have removed from your home before leaving Philadelphia. The courtroom went very quiet. Calloway was rising. Whitmore's expression, contained until this moment, shifted into something tight and warning. Whitfield moved before Calloway could speak. Your Honor, I'd like to submit to the record a letter from the U.S. Attorney's Office in Denver dated 4 days ago, establishing that documents provided by Mrs. Cole have been accepted as evidence in a pending federal inquiry. He held out the papers. The clerk took them. Alderman took them. Calloway's objection died half-formed. Alderman read the letter. He read it twice. Then he looked at Whitmore on the stand with an expression that had changed from watchful to something more specific. Mr. Whitmore, Alderman said, and his voice had changed too. I'd like to understand something. The documents the federal government has accepted into evidence your daughter provided those. That information is a simple question, Alderman said. Did your daughter provide evidence of federal crimes to federal authorities? Whitmore looked at Calloway. Calloway had nothing to give him. She provided certain documents, Whitmore said carefully, whose contents are disputed. The U.S. Attorney does not appear to find them disputed, Alderman said. He set the letter down. Continue, Mr. Whitfield. Whitfield turned back to Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, your daughter left Philadelphia, traveled alone to Montana, entered into a marriage, corrected fraudulent business practices at her husband's ranch, identified and reported violations of federal law, and cooperated fully with a federal inquiry. He paused. In your view, these are the actions of someone who lacks the capacity to manage her own affairs. The silence stretched. She acted without consulting, Whitmore started. She acted, Whitfield said, competently, independently, in the public interest. He held Whitmore's gaze. Perhaps what troubles you, Mr. Whitmore, is not that your daughter can't manage her affairs. Perhaps what troubles you is that she can, and she doesn't need your permission. Calloway was on his feet. Objection. Withdrawn, Whitfield said pleasantly. No further questions. Eleanor took the stand in the afternoon. She sat straight. She answered every question Calloway put to her in a voice that was clear and steady. And when he tried to lead her, when he angled questions toward emotional reactions, toward instability, toward the narrative of a woman who had acted in panic, she answered precisely what was asked, and nothing more. When Whitfield questioned her, he kept it simple. Mrs. Cole, why did you leave Philadelphia? Because I was not willing to be transferred between two men's business arrangements without my knowledge or consent, she said. Why did you come to Montana? Because I answered an honest advertisement from a man who wanted a partner, not a property. Has your husband ever treated you as property? Never, she said. Not once. Has he ever prevented you from making your own decisions? No, she said. He has supported every decision I've made, even when it complicated his life significantly. Do you love your husband, Mrs. Cole? The courtroom went quiet. Eleanor had not expected that question. Whitfield had not told her he was going to ask it. She looked at Whitfield for one unguarded moment, and then she looked at Mason, who was sitting in the gallery behind the bar, and he was looking back at her with those quiet, steady dark eyes that didn't flinch from anything. She looked back at Whitfield. Yes, she said, simply, without hesitation. I do. Whitfield nodded. Thank you, he said. No further questions. In the gallery, Mason sat very still with his hat in his hands, and something happening in his chest that he had no words for and didn't need any. He'd heard her. That was enough. That was more than enough. Calloway's redirect was brief. He knew he was losing ground, and he was too professional to spend more of it. When he sat down, the courtroom had the specific quality of a space in which a decision has already been made, and everyone is waiting for it to be spoken. Alderman called a recess of 30 minutes. Eleanor came back through the bar and sat beside Mason, and neither of them said anything. He handed her a glass of water that a clerk had left on the table. She drank it. Their shoulders touched and stayed touching. Dutch was in the back of the gallery. He gave Mason a look that said everything Dutch Hargrove had been wanting to say for 3 months and had been too discreet to articulate. Mason gave him a small nod back. The 30 minutes lasted about a year. Then Alderman returned. He settled himself. He looked at his papers, then at the courtroom, then at Eleanor. I've heard the petition and the evidence presented by both parties, he said. I've reviewed the documentation provided regarding federal proceedings. He set his papers down with the deliberate care of a man choosing his words. The competency petition asks this court to find that Eleanor Whitmore Cole lacks the capacity to manage her own affairs and welfare. The room held its breath. The evidence presented does not support that finding, Alderman said. In fact, the evidence presented suggests the opposite, that Mrs. Cole has demonstrated consistent, rational, capable management of herself and her circumstances, including material cooperation with federal authorities in a matter of significant public importance. He looked at Calloway. The petition is denied. The sound in the courtroom was not dramatic. It was the quiet exhale of a room releasing something held too long. Eleanor did not move for a moment. Then she let out one slow breath, and Mason felt it against his arm, and he reached over and put his hand on the table beside hers, and she covered it with her own. At the plaintiff's table, Clarence Whitmore sat with his hands folded and his face perfectly composed, and he was looking at his daughter, and Mason, watching him, saw something in that composed face that was not anger and was not calculation. It was loss. The loss of a man who had understood too late that the thing he'd been trying to possess was the thing he'd been driving away. Mason looked away from him. That was Whitmore's to carry. It wasn't his. Eleanor was already talking to Whitfield in a low voice, practical, as always, asking about next steps, about the federal timeline, about what Alderman's ruling meant for the competency challenge if Calloway tried to refile. Whitfield was answering her, and she was nodding, and Mason sat beside her and listened to her be exactly who she was. Precise, forward-moving, already 3 steps ahead, and thought that this woman had walked into his yard 4 months ago with trouble behind her and an empty bag full of everything she needed to survive. And she had stayed, and she had built something, and she had said in open court that she loved him. He was going to say it back. He was going to say it clearly and without ceremony, the way he did things that mattered, the way he'd built the house and fixed the fence and planted himself on this mountain and decided to stay. But not here, not in this courtroom with its echoes and its strangers. At home. On the porch in the mountain dark, where things said between 2 people stayed between 2 people and had the weight they were supposed to have. He'd waited 4 years to feel something like this. He could wait 1 more day to say it. They drove out of Helena the next morning before the sun was fully up. Whitfield had shaken their hands on the courthouse steps the evening before, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done his job well and knew it. Marshal Garrett had stopped them in the hotel lobby to confirm that the federal inquiry was formally open, that both Clarence Whitmore and Senator Aldrich were under investigation by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Denver, and that Thomas Aldrich had agreed to provide a full written statement. Garrett had looked at Eleanor when he said that last part with an expression that was as close to admiration as a federal marshal permitted himself in professional settings. "You built a strong case, Mrs. Cole," he said. "I just told the truth," she said. "In my experience," Garrett said, "that's the harder part." He tipped his hat and walked away, and Eleanor had stood in the hotel lobby for a moment with that look on her face she got when something had landed that she needed to carry quietly for a while. Mason had put his hand on her back just briefly, just a steadying touch, and she had leaned into it by about half an inch, which was Eleanor's version of leaning into something completely. Now they were on the road north, the wagon moving easy in the early morning cool, and the mountains were ahead of them, and the city was behind them, and the particular weight of the last 3 weeks was beginning slowly to lift. Eleanor had been quiet since they left the hotel. Not the tight-managed quiet of someone containing something difficult, a different kind, looser. Like a person who had been holding their breath for a very long time and had finally carefully started to breathe normally again. Mason let her have it. He drove and watched the road and waited. After about an hour, she said, "He didn't fight the ruling." "No," Mason agreed. "He could have. Calloway could have filed for an appeal on procedural grounds. They had time before Alderman left the bench." She looked at her hands in her lap. "He didn't." "I know." "Why do you think—" Mason considered that honestly. "I think he looked at those documents Whitfield submitted from the U.S. Attorney," he said, "and he understood that if he pushed further, the federal case becomes the story instead of the competency petition. And the federal case has his name in it in ways he can't control." He paused. "A man like your father doesn't fold. But he knows when to stop spending resources on a position he can't hold." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "That's part of it," she said. "The calculation part." She paused again. "But I think there was something else." He waited. "He looked at me on the stand," she said, "when Whitfield asked if I loved you. He was looking at my face when I answered." She turned the thought over carefully, the way she turned everything over. He looked like a man who had just understood something he should have understood a long time ago. She looked at the road ahead. "I don't think he knows what to do with that." "Probably not," Mason said. "He's not going to become a different man," she said. "Not bitter, just clear. He's going to manage this the way he manages everything. He'll renegotiate with Aldrich, find another arrangement, rebuild what he can. He'll send Percy to monitor the federal proceedings and Calloway to limit the damage." She paused. "But I think he might leave us alone." "You sound almost sorry about it," Mason said. She looked at him sharply. Then slowly the sharpness softened into something more complicated. "He's my father," she said. "I spent 27 years wanting him to see me as a person. That doesn't—" She stopped. "It doesn't switch off because he finally did." "No," Mason said. "It doesn't." She looked at him. "Does that make sense?" "Makes complete sense," he said. "You can be done with what someone did to you and still grieve what they couldn't be." He kept his eyes on the road. Those two things don't cancel each other out. She watched his profile for a moment. "You know that from experience," she said. "Rachel's mother," he said, "blamed me for a long time after. Couldn't blame the fever, so she blamed what was near." He was quiet a beat. "Eventually I stopped being angry at her for it. Didn't mean I stopped feeling what she'd done. Both things just lived in the same place." Eleanor sat with that. "I didn't know about her mother. Never came up," he said. "Not something I talk about much." "No," she said, and then carefully, "You can, though, if you want. Talk about things." She paused. "I'd like to know about Rachel. If that's not—" "It's all right," he said. He said it and meant it, which surprised him slightly. 4 months ago, the subject had been a door he kept shut. Now it was just a room in the house, one he didn't go into every day, but that was part of the house nonetheless. She was practical too in her way, but warm with it. She could make a whole room full of people feel like they were each the most important person in it. He paused. "She would have liked you." Eleanor looked at him. "She'd have driven you a little crazy too," he said. "She was loud about her opinions. You would have argued." The corner of his mouth moved. "I'd have enjoyed that." Eleanor made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more tender. "I would have liked her," she said. "I know," he said. They rode for a while without talking, and it was the best kind of quiet, the kind that had everything in it and didn't need adding to. They came home in the late afternoon, and Dutch was in the yard before the wagon had fully stopped. He didn't say anything. He looked at Mason's face and then at Eleanor's, and he nodded once, a short, sharp nod, and that was his version of celebration. Then he took the horses and said over his shoulder, "Bet made a roast. There's enough for 4 and then some," and walked them toward the barn. Bet was in the kitchen when they came in, and she looked at Eleanor and immediately crossed the room and took both her hands and looked at her face, and whatever she saw there made her squeeze those hands hard and say, "Good," with a ferocity that was entirely Bet Hargrove and entirely what Eleanor needed in that moment. Eleanor squeezed back. "Good," she agreed. They ate around the kitchen table, the 4 of them, and Dutch made terrible jokes, and Bet talked about the mare who was going to foal any day now, and Mason ate more than he'd eaten in 3 weeks, because the tension of the last month had been sitting between his shoulders and his appetite, and was now finally gone. Eleanor ate steadily and talked with Bet about the lavender in the window boxes, which had apparently done something Dutch considered significant while they were in Helena. "Came up all the way," Dutch said. "Full bloom. Front of the house looks different." Eleanor looked at Mason. Mason looked at Eleanor. "Told you they were hardy," she said. "You were right," he said. For what was probably the 12th time since July, and he meant it every time. After supper, Dutch and Bet went home, and the house settled into its nighttime quiet, and Eleanor was at the table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, Not looking at the accounts, just sitting, which she rarely did. Sitting without a purpose, except to be still. Mason stood by the door for a moment. Then he said, "Come outside." She looked up. "The porch?" he said. "There's something I want to say, and I'd rather say it out there." She held his gaze for one searching moment. Then she set down her cup and followed him. The night was clear and cold, the way October nights on the mountain were clear and cold, absolute, with stars that had no competition, and a silence that had weight. They stood on the porch, and Mason could see the window boxes in the dark, and Dutch was right that they looked different. And he thought about Rachel's marigolds, and Eleanor's lavender, and how the same boxes could hold different things, and still be the same boxes, and still be on the same porch of the same house, and how that was not a contradiction. He turned to face her. She was watching him with those clear eyes that didn't flinch from anything, and there was something in them that knew what was coming, or close to it, and wasn't moving away. "I heard what you said in court," he said, "when Whitfield asked you." "I know you did," she said quietly. "I didn't ask him to ask it," he said. "Just want you to know that. What you said was yours. I didn't arrange for it." "I know," she said. "He surprised me too." "Did you mean it?" She looked at him steadily. "Mason," she said, "I have spent the last 4 months watching you refuse $30,000, put yourself between me and every person my father sent, tell the truth in a courtroom about marrying me because you were lonely, and then sit beside me while I said I loved you without flinching." She paused. "Yes, I meant it." He was quiet for a moment, just holding that, letting it be real. "I'm not good at—" he started. "I know," she said. "I don't say things the way some men say things. I know. But I want to say this clearly," he said, "so there's no question about it later." He looked at her in the dark, at the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in July, with trouble behind her, and had in 4 months made his house into a home, and his accounts into a working operation, and his evenings into something he looked forward to, instead of just survived. "I love you, Eleanor. My wife. I love you, and I should have said it before a courtroom got to it, and I'm saying it now." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face was very open, that rare version of her, the unguarded one, the one that appeared in small moments, and that he suspected not many people in her life had been permitted to see. "You said it now," she said. "That's what matters." He reached out and put his hand against her face, careful the way he was careful with things he didn't want to mishandle, and she put her hand over his and held it there, and then he leaned forward and kissed her. Not on the cheek this time, not the brief, careful thing from 11 weeks ago, but properly the way a man kisses his wife when he has meant it for a long time, and is done waiting to show it. She kissed him back, without hesitation, with all the directness she brought to everything. When they broke apart, she was still holding his hand against her face, and her eyes were bright, and she said, "You took long enough." He laughed. A real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere unguarded, the kind Dutch had told Bet had come back gradually over the months, and Eleanor's face changed when she heard it, something in it going warm and private and entirely hers. "I'm a deliberate man," he said. "Extremely," she agreed. And she was smiling fully properly, not the almost smile she usually permitted herself, and it did something to his chest that he was done trying to categorize. They stood on the porch a while longer, and the mountain held them in its dark and its cold, and its enormous indifference to the affairs of people, which was one of the things Mason had always loved about it. The mountain didn't care what you'd survived or how long it had taken you. It just held you up while you figured things out. 3 weeks after they got home from Helena Dutch's mare fold, Mason was called to the barn at 2 in the morning, and he went without waking Eleanor, and the foaling went well. A healthy filly, dark as her mother, already trying to stand with that particular new creature's stubbornness that made Dutch grin like a man 20 years younger. "What'll you call her?" Mason said. Dutch looked at the filly. "Betty wants to call her something sensible," he said. "I want to call her Justice." He glanced at Mason sideways. Seems appropriate. Mason looked at the filly standing now on uncertain legs and thought about the word, about what the last 4 months had been and what they'd come through and what was sitting on the other side of all of it. Not a grand resolution, not a triumphant arrival, but something quieter and more durable. Something that felt like the filly looked. Uncertain on its feet, but alive and standing, and in possession of all the time it needed to get stronger. "Justice," he said. That'll do. He was back in the house before the first gray of dawn, and Eleanor was awake. She always heard when he came back from the barn. He'd noticed even when she pretended she hadn't, and she looked at him from her side of the kitchen, where she'd put the kettle on, and he said, "Filly, Dutch wants to call her Justice." Eleanor considered that. "Good name," she said. "That's what I told him." She poured 2 cups and set one in front of his chair and sat across from him, and they drank their coffee in the early morning quiet, and through the window the lavender was there in its boxes, and the sky was doing that thing it did before full sunrise, going from black to the particular blue that was only ever that blue for about 20 minutes before it changed into something else. "A letter came from Cross yesterday," Eleanor said, "while you were with the horses." He looked at her. "The federal inquiry has formally expanded," she said. "They've subpoenaed Aldrich Sr.'s correspondence. And—" she held his gaze. "There's a second name. Someone in the Department of the Interior. A commissioner who signed off on land grants that should never have been approved." She paused. "It's bigger than my father." "How much bigger?" "Cross says 6 territories," she said. "Maybe more once they pull the threads." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "My father is cooperating. Calloway sent Cross a letter. My father has agreed to provide testimony in exchange for it doesn't matter what for. He's cooperating." Mason sat with that. "You all right?" She looked at her cup. "He made a choice," she said. "He's living with it the only way he knows how, by making another deal." Something moved through her face. "I used to think that was the worst thing about him. Now I think it's just him. That's who he is. He makes deals. It's the only language he has." She looked up. "I'm all right. I've been all right about him for a while now. It just—" She stopped. "It just takes a moment sometimes, when new information comes in." "Take the moment," he said. She nodded, took it, set it aside. "Cross also says the territorial commissioner in Denver is facing formal charges, and that the land grants your area, the ones north of Pine Ridge, the ones Whitmore's railroad was trying to acquire, they've been frozen pending the inquiry." Mason went still. "That land's been tied up for 3 years. It'll be released through proper process once the inquiry concludes," Eleanor said. "Cross says the homesteaders who had claims wrongfully denied will have grounds to refile." She paused. "That includes the Hadley family and the McKee brothers." Mason set his cup down. He thought about the Hadley family. Tom Hadley, who'd been fighting a land claim denial for 2 years, who had 3 kids and a wife, and a piece of land his father had worked before him. He thought about the McKee brothers, who'd told anyone who'd listen that the denial of their claim smelled wrong, and who'd been dismissed as sore losers by everyone who had more to gain from the current arrangement. "They were right," Mason said. "They were right," Eleanor agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "Tom Hadley came to me in August," he said. "Asked if I knew anyone in the land office. I told him I didn't know enough to help." He picked up his cup. "I'm going to ride over to his place today." Eleanor looked at him with that warm, steady expression she had sometimes that she probably didn't know she had, the one that wasn't a performance for anyone, that was just how her face went when she was looking at him without managing it. "Yes," she said. "You should." He rode to the Hadley farm that morning and told Tom what he knew, and Tom Hadley sat on his porch and was very quiet for a moment, and then he said, "My father filed that claim in '78. And his voice had something in it that was 6 years of fighting compressing itself into a sentence. "Cross is the man to contact," Mason said. "I'll write the name down. He knows the situation." Tom Hadley looked at him. How'd this come about? My wife, Mason said. She had the right documents at the right time. Hadley was quiet again. Then he said, "Tell her thank you." "I will," Mason said. "I'll tell her." He rode home and told her, and she received it the way she received things that mattered, quietly with something careful in her face, processing it somewhere private. Then she said, "It's not enough to undo 6 years of someone's life." "No," Mason said. "But it's something." "It's something," she agreed. And that was all she said, but he knew her well enough now to know that it meant more than that the something sat with her in the way that things sat with her when they'd landed in the part of her that took things seriously. The federal inquiry broke publicly in November. The Denver papers ran it first. Railroad corruption scheme, spans 6 territories. Federal investigation. Widens. And then the Helena paper ran it, and then the Billings paper, and eventually the Eastern papers got hold of it, and it was the kind of story that sold copies, because it had everything: money, power, political names, a scheme that had been running for years under the cover of legitimate business. Clarence Whitmore's name appeared in every version of the story. So did Aldrich's. So did the commissioner from Denver. So did 6 other names Eleanor hadn't known when she'd first opened her father's study and started reading documents in the dark. The Pine Ridge Gazette ran a piece that mentioned Eleanor Cole by name as a key source of evidence for the federal inquiry. It was a short piece, factual, without the embroidered implications of the Helena article that had run in September. Mrs. Oakes cut it out and sent it up to the ranch with a jar of her winter preserves and a note that said simply, "Well done." Eleanor put the clipping in her account book between pages she looked at every day. Bet came up that weekend and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the clipping, and then looked at Eleanor with her particular quality of feeling everything loudly and said, "I'm so proud of you I could burst." "Don't burst," Eleanor said. "I need you intact." Bet laughed, and then cried a little, and then ate 3 of the biscuits Eleanor had made and declared them better than her own, which was, as Mason understood it, the highest compliment Bet Hargrove dispensed. The story ran. The inquiry proceeded, and the world which had been pressing in from all directions since July began gradually to recede. It was Dutch who noticed the East Room first. He came into the house one morning in late November to find Mason, and he stopped in the hallway because the door to the East Room was open, standing open, light coming through it from the window that caught the morning, and he stood there for a moment looking at it. Mason came out of the kitchen and saw Dutch standing there, looking at the open door. "Eleanor wanted more space," Mason said. "For the desk. The kitchen table's getting crowded with the new accounts." Dutch looked at him. Mason looked back. "All right," Dutch said. "Nothing else." But his face said everything else, and Mason let it say it because Dutch had been there when that door had closed and had never once pushed, and he'd earned the right to this moment. He went to find Eleanor, who was at the new desk in the East Room, in the morning light from the window, with a ledger open in front of her, and her hair loose the way it was sometimes in the mornings before she put it up, and she looked up when he came in. "Dutch saw the door," Mason said. "I know," she said. "I heard him stop." She looked at him with her clear, direct eyes. "Was that all right, opening it, I mean? It's your house, and I should have—" "It's our house," he said. She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "It is." He came over to the desk and looked at what she was working on. The winter accounts projections for January and February, a comparison of this year's costs against last year's, a list of the 3 suppliers they'd added since September, who were honest and charged honest prices. She'd drawn lines in her careful, even hand, and the numbers were there in their columns, and everything added up to something that was going to be fine. "You're projecting a surplus," he said. "A modest one," she said. "February will be tighter, but if the beef prices hold at what Bozeman is predicting—" She tapped the number. "We'll come out ahead." He put his hand on her shoulder. She reached up and covered it with hers. "First surplus in 3 years," he said. "I know," she said. "Dutch told me what it looked like before." She paused. "You weren't losing badly. You were losing slowly, which is almost worse because it's harder to see. I was spending time on the wrong things, he said. Didn't have anyone to tell me that. She tilted her head back and looked up at him. You have someone now, she said. I do, he said. And he said it the way he said things that were simply true and didn't need decorating. She turned back to the accounts. He stayed where he was, his hand on her shoulder, and looked at the morning light coming through the east window, the one she'd asked him about in their first week. The window that caught the morning, and thought about how a room could be closed and then opened, and both things could be true of the same room. How the closing hadn't erased what had been in it and the opening hadn't replaced it. How it was just a room now. His room, their room, part of the house. He went to work. She stayed at the desk. And through the morning, the sounds of the ranch went on around them. Dutch in the barn, the horses moving, the small, ordinary sounds of a working place that was going to be all right. And none of it required anything dramatic of either of them. That was the thing about this life. It wasn't dramatic mostly. It was early mornings, and account books, and difficult horses, and cold winters, and the occasional crisis, and the slow, patient work of building something that held. It was a kind of happiness that didn't announce itself, that didn't arrive in a moment you could point to and say there, but that accumulated day by day, like good soil, dense and dark, and made of everything that had broken down and been absorbed and had become finally something that things could grow in. Check. December came with its first serious snow, which arrived 2 days before Christmas and stayed. They had Dutch and Bet for Christmas dinner, and two of the ranch hands who had nowhere else to go, and Reverend Haynes and his wife, who had married them, and to whom they both felt a complicated gratitude. The table was full, and the house was warm, and there was more food than the 8 of them could reasonably eat, some of which was Eleanor's doing, and some of which was Bet's, and some of which was the result of a competition between the two women that neither had officially acknowledged. After dinner, Mason and Dutch sat on the porch in the cold, their breath visible, and Dutch said, "She's good for this place." "I know," Mason said. "She's good for you." "I know that too." Dutch looked at him sideways. "You're going to stop saying I know to everything I say." "Probably not tonight," Mason said. Dutch made a sound that was his version of laughing. They sat with their coffee, and the cold and the snow coming down in the particular silence that snow made on the mountain, absorbing everything, softening every edge. "Rachel would have liked her," Dutch said. Mason looked at the yard, the snow settling over it, the fence lines he knew by heart. "That's the second time someone said that." "Second time it's been true," Dutch said. Mason nodded. He let that sit. Let it be true and not complicated. It was he'd found possible to let two things be true at the same time once you'd stopped needing them to be in conflict with each other. Inside the house, he could hear Eleanor's voice, something she was saying to Bet, the words indistinct through the walls, and then Bet's laugh, and then Eleanor's laugh underneath it, fuller than it used to be, more frequent than it had been in July. "She laughs more," Dutch said. "I know," Mason said. Dutch looked at him. "All right," Mason said. "I'll stop." "Much appreciated," Dutch said. January brought the letter from Thomas Aldrich. It came addressed to Eleanor Care of Coal Ranch Pine Ridge, and it was short. Thomas had withdrawn fully from his father's affairs and was establishing his own legal practice in St. Louis. He wrote to say that his statement to the federal inquiry had been accepted, and that he hoped genuinely that Mrs. Cole and her husband were well. He wrote that his father was furious with him. He wrote that he found he was sleeping better than he had in years. I think he wrote at the end that doing the right thing is supposed to feel like relief. They don't tell you that. I thought it would feel like sacrifice. It feels like relief. Eleanor read the letter at the breakfast table and then passed it to Mason without comment. He read it and passed it back. "He'll be all right," she said. "He will," Mason agreed. She folded the letter carefully and put it with the Gazette clipping in the account book, a small archive of the things that had mattered and been survived. A second letter came the following week. This one from Clarence Whitmore. It was written in his hand, not dictated. Eleanor recognized the difference, and it was 4 sentences long. Eleanor, I am told the inquiry will proceed through spring at minimum. I will manage what can be managed. I hope you are well. 4 sentences. No apology, no recrimination, no negotiation. Eleanor sat with those 4 sentences for a long time. Then she got out her writing paper and she wrote back. 1 sentence. Father, I am well. She sealed it and gave it to the supply rider to post, and then she went back to the accounts and didn't bring it up again. But that evening on the porch, she sat close to Mason, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into it fully this time, without the half-inch compromise, and said nothing for a long while. Then she said, I don't need him to be different. No, Mason said. I just need him to let us alone. I know. I think he will, she said. I think in his way that letter was him saying he will. Mason tightened his arm around her. Then that's enough, he said. It doesn't have to be more than it is. She turned her face into his shoulder for a moment, and he felt her exhale slow, complete the exhalation of something that had been held for a very long time and was finally being set down for good. No, she said from his shoulder. It doesn't. March came, and with it, the first signs of the mountain coming back to life, and Eleanor started a vegetable garden on the south side of the house that she'd been planning on paper since January. Dutch built her the bed she'd designed following her specifications, exactly which Mason noted was not something Dutch did for anyone on any subject, and Bet came up to help with the planting, and the 2 women spent an afternoon in the good March sun doing the work while Mason and Dutch fixed the south pasture fence and pretended they weren't listening to the conversation drifting over from the garden. You think she's happy, Dutch said low. Mason glanced over at Eleanor, who was laughing at something Bet had said, her hands in the dirt and her face turned up to the March sun. Yeah, he said. I think she is. You sure? Not just managing. Not just making the best of things. Mason watched her for another moment. She'd put in a new system for the spring accounts that was more efficient than anything he'd run before, and she'd written to Cross about the Hadley claim and the McKee brothers claim, and had drafted the refiling letters herself. And she'd taught one of the younger ranch hands to read properly, because she'd discovered he couldn't, and considered that unacceptable. She'd ordered seeds from a catalog in Denver, and argued cheerfully with Dutch about the best place to put the tomatoes, and had beaten Mason twice at checkers, and refused to let him forget it. She's not making the best of things, he said. She's making things. He went back to the fence post. There's a difference. Dutch considered that. There is, he said. The fence got fixed. The garden got planted. The March afternoon went gold and long, the way March afternoons did when the worst of winter had passed and the world was cautiously trying again. Mason came in from the south pasture at dusk and found Eleanor at the kitchen table, with her hands still carrying traces of garden dirt and the spring accounts open in front of her and a cup of tea going cold at her elbow. She looked up when he came in. He looked at her. The woman who had stepped off a stagecoach 9 months ago in a town that didn't know her, carrying a bag full of documents and a past full of complications, looking at the exits. Who had sat across from her father and not flinched. Who had taken the stand in a territorial courthouse and said, I love you, in front of a room full of strangers without blinking. Who had opened the east room door without being asked and planted lavender in the window boxes and found the fraud in the Calhoun contracts in the first night, and made his house into something he was glad to come back to every single day. Garden's in, he said. I know, she said. I put it in. You've got dirt on your ear, he said. She put her hand up and checked. Found it. Looked at her hand with the expression of someone who had lived in Philadelphia for 27 years and was still occasionally surprised by Montana. He crossed the kitchen, took the corner of the dish towel hanging on the rack, and wiped the dirt from her ear with the same careful, deliberate movement he applied to everything that mattered to him. She held still and let him, looking up at him with her clear eyes, and he thought, this is it. This is what he hadn't known he was missing. Not the grand gestures, he'd never been a man for those. Not the declarations, not the drama. Just this. A woman at his kitchen table with garden dirt on her ear, and accounts that added up, and a laugh he'd earned by being exactly who he was. He was glad for it. He was going to keep being glad for it. "Come eat," she said. "Yeah," he said. They ate supper at the table they'd eaten at together for 9 months, and the house was warm, and the mountain was outside, holding its long silence, and the window boxes had things growing in them, and the east room door stood open to let the morning light through, and Mason Cole looked at his wife across the table and thought that a man could spend a long time running from what he'd lost and miss entirely what was finding him. He'd been found. He intended to stay found. Eleanor looked up from her plate and caught him looking and said, "What? Nothing," he said. She studied him. "That's not a nothing face." "It's a grateful face," he said. "They look the same on me." She looked at him for a moment, that clear reading look that saw everything and managed nothing, and then something in her face went quietly and completely warm. "Yes," she said softly, "they do." Outside the Montana mountain held them the way it held everything, without opinion, without sentiment, with the absolute patience of something that has been standing long enough to know that people find their way if you give them enough time and enough sky. Two strangers had come to this mountain looking for practical things, and had found something they hadn't known to look for. They had found each other. And they had chosen each other. Not out of necessity, not out of arrangement, not out of the slow accumulation of obligation, but out of the clear-eyed, deliberate, fully informed decision of two people who had seen each other at their most complicated and had decided, yes, this one, this life. In the mountains of Montana, on a ranch with lavender in the window boxes and honest numbers in the accounts, and a east room full of morning light, Mason and Eleanor Cole built what neither of them had been searching for, and both of them had needed. Not a rescue, not a bargain, a home, chosen freely, built together, and kept every day by people who understood that the keeping was the whole of it, and that it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.